Last year was the first time I ever lived alone in a house. I had just rented a small place in a new neighborhood closer to my job. I moved in around early October. The neighborhood seemed quiet, and most of the neighbors kept to themselves, so I did the same. The first few weeks were pretty normal. By the time Halloween rolled around, I noticed only a couple of houses had decorations. Nothing fancy, just a few pumpkins and signs. I decided to put up a small trick or treat sign on my door and bought one small bag of candy to hand out. Where I used to live, I would buy 3 or 4 big bags, but this neighborhood didn't seem that into Halloween, so I figured one bag would be enough. That afternoon, I got a few small groups of kids at my door, but that was it. I was a little disappointed because I've always enjoyed Halloween, even if it's just handing out candy. Around 10 p.m., I put the candy in the pantry and sat down to watch a scary movie to wrap up the night. About halfway through the movie, the doorbell rang. I was confused and a little annoyed since it was late, but I got up and checked the peephole. There was a small boy, maybe around 10 or 11, standing outside in a homemade costume. It wasn't anything specific, just black clothes with red accents and a black mask. I opened the door and he said, "Trick or treat." It was almost 11 p.m. by now, and I was worried about him being out alone that late. I smiled and told him to wait while I got him some candy. I grabbed a handful from the pantry and dropped it in his pillowcase. As I handed it to him, I looked around, expecting to see his parents or friends nearby, but I didn't see anyone. The boy turned around and started walking away, and I stayed at the door for a few seconds, just to make sure he was okay. When I didn't see anyone, I closed the door and went back to the couch. A few minutes later, the doorbell rang again. This time, I went straight to the pantry, grabbed the candy, and went to the door. When I opened it, I was surprised to see the same kid, but this time he didn't have his pillowcase. Concerned, I asked, "Are you okay?" He didn't answer. I looked behind him again and noticed someone standing in my neighbor's driveway across the street, watching us. It was a man, dressed in a costume similar to the boy's. I asked, "Is that your dad over there?" The boy paused for a second, then said, "Yes." I asked why he had come back, and he simply said he wanted more candy. I thought it was strange since he didn't have his pillowcase anymore, but I held out the candy bag anyway. The boy looked annoyed for some reason, but he reluctantly grabbed a piece of candy and ran off. The whole situation creeped me out, so I made sure to lock the door. I went back to the couch and finished my movie. It was late, so I decided to head to bed. As I walked toward the stairs, I saw a light flash outside one of my windows. Nervously, I peeked outside and saw that the motion sensor lights by my garage had gone off. I stared out the window for a few minutes, feeling uneasy, but nothing else happened, so I closed the blinds and went upstairs to bed. I lay there for about 30 minutes thinking about the boy and how strange the whole thing was. Just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard a soft rustling, followed by loud banging on my front door. I jumped out of bed and quietly made my way downstairs. Just before I looked through the peephole, 3 more loud bangs shook the door, making me jump back. After a few seconds, I peeked through the hole and saw the man from earlier, standing inches away from the door in his creepy black and red costume. He was holding something, but he was too close for me to see what it was. There was no way I was opening the door. I didn't know what this guy wanted, but it didn't feel right. I ran upstairs, locked myself in my room, and called 911. The man kept banging on the door for about a minute before it went silent. I stayed upstairs, terrified, hoping he had left. Eventually, I looked out of my bedroom window, which had a small view of the front sidewalk. Just as I was checking, I heard the sound of glass shattering downstairs. My heart was racing. I had no way to defend myself if he came upstairs. Thankfully, I heard police sirens approaching, and soon after, footsteps rushed out of the house. I waited until the police knocked on the door and called for me. When I let them in, they searched the house and found a broken window in the kitchen where the man had entered. I stayed in a hotel for a few days after that, just to be safe. The man never came back, but I still think about that night a lot, wondering if he was using his kid to try to get into my house. Nothing was stolen, which makes me wonder what he was really after. It's almost Halloween again, and I'm starting to get nervous that he might come back to finish what he started. 4 years ago, I lived in a tiny one-bedroom house with one of my best friends. We couldn't afford anything bigger, so we made do with what we had. I slept on a futon in the living room while my friend had the bedroom. This story takes place in the fall when it was just starting to get cold. My friend went to visit his sister for a few days, so I was alone in the house. It was the weekend, which meant I had both days to enjoy the space by myself. I didn't mind having my friend around, but it was nice to not be crammed together for a change. On Sunday night, I went out to pick up some groceries and got home around 7 p.m. I had work the next day, but since I was alone, I decided to stay up a little later and watch a movie. I settled on the couch and almost finished it when I heard a quiet thump from down the hallway. I looked over but didn't see anything, so I figured it was just the house settling and kept watching the movie. For the next 30 minutes, there were no other sounds, so I completely forgot about the thump. When the movie was over, I filled my water bottle and went back to the futon, pulling it out into a bed and lying down. I was on my phone for a while before I finally fell asleep around 11 p.m. I woke up later feeling groggy with heavy eyes and blurry vision. I wasn't sure why I had woken up, but I knew it was still late. As I rubbed my eyes, I heard a faint sound from the other side of the house. It was wood creaking, like someone was carefully walking across the floorboards. My heart started racing as I got off the futon and walked down the hallway. The creaking stopped, but I felt a chill run down my spine. I walked until I reached the door to my friend's bedroom and leaned against it to listen. It was quiet, not a sound coming from anywhere in the house. I slowly turned the doorknob and pushed it open a few inches. Looking around the room, I saw it was empty but messy, with things scattered all over the floor and bed. Confused, I stepped inside and turned on the light. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure move between the closet doors. I jumped back, slammed the door shut, and ran to grab my phone. I heard the closet door opening and footsteps heading into the hallway. I got my phone and rushed to the back door, seeing a large man coming down the hallway toward me. I managed to escape through the backyard, and luckily, he didn't follow me. A minute later, I reached a place where I felt safe and called the police. They searched the house, but didn't find anything useful to figure out who the man was or why he was there. They weren't sure how he got in either, but it seemed likely that he broke in while I was out getting groceries. When my friend got back, he was just as terrified as I was when I told him what happened. We eventually moved out of that house, hoping we'd never encounter that man again. I bought my first house in my early 20s and lived alone. I was happy and at peace living by myself, so I decided to move to the countryside instead of staying in the city where my apartment was. I had a few neighbors, but we mostly kept to ourselves, which I didn't mind. The house was a ranch-style home, which meant there was no second floor, just a basement and the first floor. My master bedroom was at the back of the house, looking out at a small yard and then woods beyond that. The basement had a bilco door, which is 2 steel doors that swing out. To get into the basement, you go down some steps and through a regular door. In the summer, I usually didn't lock those bilco doors since I might need to get into the basement from the backyard. But in winter, I locked them since I didn't need to go in and out of the basement. The first 2 years were peaceful. I could walk out my back door and go hunting in the woods. I loved opening my garage door from sunrise to sunset without anyone bothering me. I worked a rotating 12-hour day-night shift, which was tough to get used to. I often had trouble switching from night shift to day shift, either sleeping too much or not enough. But the schedule was predictable, so I could plan my days off. One night in December, I had just finished 3 night shifts. I struggled to fall asleep on my first night off because I needed to adjust my body to sleep at night again for the next 3 days. It was snowing outside since about 5 p.m., and by the time I went to bed around 11 p.m., there were already a few inches on the ground. I fell asleep within an hour. I woke up around 3 a.m., and the house was completely silent. I laid there in the dark, hoping to drift back to sleep. But after a couple of minutes, I heard a loud banging right outside my bedroom window. It sounded like someone was trying to open the locked Bilko doors to the basement. I jumped out of bed and ran down the long hallway to the sliding glass door at the back of the house, where I turned on the outside floodlights. I looked out the sliding glass door toward the Bilko doors, but there was nobody there. As I looked closer, I saw fresh footprints in the snow coming from the small path in the woods, leading right up to the basement doors. There was no snow on the handle, showing that someone had recently tried to open them. I also noticed a second set of footprints leading away from the basement doors, with signs that someone had run away fast. I stayed awake until almost dawn, keeping the floodlights on. When it got light outside, I decided to follow the tracks into the woods, but the new snow and blowing wind had completely covered them up. After walking a few feet into the woods, I figured that whoever was trying to break in probably heard me running down the hallway and ran off before I could reach the sliding glass door and turn on the lights. I decided not to call the police since nothing was damaged or stolen. From that day on, I made sure to keep all the doors locked and didn't leave the garage open all day unless I was working there. 8 years later, I sold the house without any more incidents after that one event. When I was 16, I lived with my parents in a regular home in the suburbs. My parents liked to take a lot of trips for both work and fun, so whenever they were away during the school year, I would stay home and watch the house for a few days to a whole week. I didn't mind it. Sometimes I even enjoyed having the place to myself. One week, my parents were gone for 6 days. Every night, I would go out to get food. On the second night, I spent nearly 4 hours playing video games on my computer. It was a Friday, so I stayed up late and didn't have any homework. But around 8:15 p.m., I realized I hadn't eaten anything yet. I took a break and drove to a nearby sandwich shop. It was close to closing time, so I didn't expect to see a line. When I walked in, there was one man standing at the counter. He looked like he had just ordered and was waiting for his food. I stepped around him, placed my order, and then stood behind him to wait. While I was there, I noticed how rugged he looked. He was tall and skinny, wearing old clothes and had long, thinning hair. When he got his food, he left, and I couldn't help but watch him go, curious about his unusual appearance. A few minutes later, I got my food and headed to my car. The roads were quiet, so I got home quickly. I went to my room, sat at my desk, and turned on a video to watch while I ate. It was 9 p.m., but I wasn't tired and planned to stay up for a few more hours. As I was sitting there, I heard a quick sound from downstairs. I paused the video and listened, but didn't hear anything else. I stood up and leaned my head into the hallway, still not hearing anything. I didn't pay much attention at first, and the sound was too quick for me to tell where it came from. Thinking it was probably nothing, I still wanted to check, so I walked downstairs and looked around. Everything was as I had left it. When I walked past the front door, I realized what the sound was. I grabbed the door handle and shook it to recreate the sound. Someone had tried the door. I quickly looked out the peephole, but saw nothing. Then I ran to the back door. Scanning the backyard, I spotted a figure standing by the shed, facing away from the house. He was tall and thin, and I was almost sure it was the man I had seen at the sandwich shop earlier that night. Moments later, he forced the shed doors open and stepped inside. I took this chance to call the police, so I ran back to my room and dialed 911 while keeping an eye on the shed from my window. The operator said officers were on their way, but less than a minute later, the man rushed out of the shed holding several large tools. He hurried toward the house, going straight for the back door. My heart raced, and I didn't know what to do. I ran for it, sprinting down the stairs and heading for the front door. As I ran outside into my front yard and onto the street, I saw the man still trying to break down the back door. I made it to the corner of the block, and after a few minutes, 2 police cars pulled into the driveway and entered through the open front door. I walked back to the house just as they pulled the man out and locked him in their car. They found him holding a heavy pipe wrench that he had taken from my parents' shed. Inside the house, it looked like he had gone on a rampage, destroying everything he could in the few minutes it took for the cops to arrive. Why he followed me home and did what he did is unknown, but he clearly didn't seem stable. If I had stayed inside, there's no doubt he would have broken into my room before the police got there, and I can't imagine what might have happened to me. I was 23 and worked full-time at a small pizza shop in my town. My best friend Tim and I had night shifts there. The place was tiny, with only 3 or 4 tables. We mostly did takeout and delivery. We both got jobs there while in college and just never left. The shop was in a quiet rural area, so work wasn't too busy. Most days we had a steady flow of orders, but on this night there was a light storm outside making business slow. By 10 p.m., Tim suggested we start cleaning up and maybe clock out a bit early. I grabbed some rags to wipe down the tables when the phone rang at the front desk. I answered it after a few rings, but no one was there. Just a prank call, I thought, and went back to cleaning. Suddenly, I noticed a car parked a little way back from the shop. I couldn't see well through the rain, but it looked like a light was on inside, like a cell phone. The shop was on its own lot, so I figured that was the only car around. A minute later, the phone rang again. Tim picked it up this time, and I heard a muffled voice on the line. After a short chat, he hung up, and at the same time, the light in the car turned off, and it drove away. I told Tim what I saw and how it felt weird, but he shrugged it off, saying it was probably just an old man ordering pizza for delivery. I thought it was odd since no one would order delivery while parked right outside the shop, but I let it go. Tim started making a pizza while I kept cleaning. 10 minutes later, he boxed it up and handed it to me for delivery. I ran through the rain to my car, pulled up the address on my phone, and it was about 11 minutes away. Not too bad. I started driving, and the roads were empty. Google Maps took me to a neighborhood with big homes, then led me down a long driveway to a cul-de-sac with 3 houses. I parked in front of one of the older, fancy-looking homes and checked the address again. It matched, so I picked up the pizza and went to the front door. "Pizza delivery," I called out, but all the lights were off. I called Tim to check on the order, but his call went straight to voicemail. Frustrated, I ran back to my car, tossed the pizza in the passenger seat, and started to back out. It wasn't unusual to get fake orders or dead deliveries, but it always annoyed me. When I got back, Tim said there were no more orders, so we could finish up and head out. I tossed the pizza in the trash, and we both started cleaning the ovens and counters. Then we heard a loud bang from the front of the shop. We looked at each other, confused, and ran to the front. At first, we didn't see anything, but then Tim noticed a crack on the door. I opened it and found a heavy rock lying outside. The parking lot was empty, and we were really freaked out. Tim suggested calling the cops, but we didn't want to deal with that right then. It was just 10 minutes until our shift ended, and we figured we could tell our manager the next day. We quickly finished cleaning and left through the back door where our cars were parked. On the drive home, I kept thinking about everything that had happened. When I got inside, I knew I should get to bed soon, but I wanted a snack first. As I headed to the kitchen, I heard a car splashing through puddles outside. I peeked out the window and saw a car parked right in front of my driveway. It only took me a second to realize it was the same car from the pizza shop. A chill ran through me, and I stayed by the window to see what was going on. The car was still running, but I couldn't see inside. After a minute of no movement, I called Tim and told him that I thought one of the customers followed me home. He urged me to call the cops immediately. I felt nervous, but knew I needed to. I dialed 911, and the operator told me to stay hidden while they sent someone. Then I heard a car door open and close, so I quickly hung up. I looked back out the window, and a man was walking up my driveway. He was dressed in dark clothes, his hood covering his face. As he approached, I closed the curtains and waited. I could hear his steps on the front porch. Then he walked past the house and stopped outside my window. It was so quiet that the sound of the rain got louder. I felt like I stood there forever before I finally peeked through the curtain. The man's cold eyes were staring back at me. I let go of the curtain and he banged on the window. I was terrified, standing a few feet away. Then, just like that, it all stopped. No more banging, no footsteps, nothing. All I could hear was the rain tapping against the window. When the police finally arrived, there was no sign of the man or his car. I told them everything that had happened that night, and they looked at me like I was crazy. I felt a bit crazy too, because none of it made sense. There didn't seem to be any reason for the man's actions. The whole night messed with my head. I'm hoping that by sharing this, someone can help me understand what happened and why the man did what he did. It sounds odd, but even now, on quiet, rainy days, I get an eerie feeling that takes me back to that night. I once went hiking alone in the woods outside of town. I didn't know the area well, but I thought I'd be fine if I stayed on the trail. Since I wasn't planning to camp overnight, I just brought a light pack. However, I got distracted by the beautiful scenery and ended up getting lost. I thought I could finish the 5-mile loop in about 2 hours, but after 4 hours, I was still wandering around. I hadn't paid close attention to the map, so the trail markers weren't helping me. I tried to use my phone to get help, but I had no signal and the GPS wasn't working properly. I kept moving, trying to stay calm, but after 6 hours, I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in a long time. That's when I started to feel scared, especially since it was getting dark. I had used my phone too much and the battery was almost dead. The last thing it showed was that there was a road a couple of miles north. I had only a flashlight and a compass, so I used those to make my way through the dark brush until I finally reached the highway, over 8 hours after I started. I felt a wave of relief, but I knew I still wasn't safe. I joked to myself that my hike had turned into a hitchhike. It was pitch black except for the stars and a little moon peeking through the trees. After about 10 minutes, the first car came by, but they didn't stop. Another truck came along about 10 minutes later, and thankfully, they pulled over. It was an old pickup driven by a rough-looking man, but I was just happy to see someone. He asked me where I was going, and I told him I needed to get back to the trailhead. He agreed, and I climbed in. I noticed a shotgun sticking out from the cushions of his seat, but I didn't think too much of it. I figured most locals carried guns. My bigger worry was the strong smell of alcohol on his breath, which made me nervous about his driving. As we drove, we made small talk. I gave him a fake name, Jack, and he told me his name was Jonah, which I suspected was also fake. He worked in a lumber mill, and I worked from home. He had a family, while I was single. He seemed skilled at many things, while I felt like a novice at hiking. I trusted he knew where we were going because everything looked the same, a long, dark road lined with tall trees. I didn't even question him when we turned down a gravel driveway. It felt like forever since I'd last seen the trailhead, and I didn't remember if it was a paved, gravel, or dirt road. Suddenly, Jonah started saying some strange things. "You know," he said, "my family doesn't have TV or Wi-Fi. It's hard to find fun out here, but sometimes a whole truckload of fun just falls into your lap." "What do you mean?" I asked, confused. Jonah paused, and just then we rounded a bend. My heart sank as I realized he wasn't taking me back to the trailhead. He had brought me to his house, a run-down trailer. There was a light on, and when the headlights hit the side of the trailer, a woman and a teenager came to the window. Their expressions looked unsettling. "That's my family," Jonah said with a smile. "They'll be happy to meet you after they greet you, of course." I felt a wave of fear wash over me. "What's going on? Why did you bring me here?" I shouted. Jonah parked the truck, turned to me, and said with a grin, "You're going to entertain my family for a while." Panic surged through me as I turned to escape, but the door wouldn't open. "That's the child lock," Jonah said, chuckling. When I turned to yell at him, I saw the shotgun aimed right at me. "You better do what I say," Jonah said quietly. "I could make things very difficult for you right now." Then he ordered me to get out of the truck. I felt trapped but knew I had to act. When he commanded me to walk toward the house, I knew I had to take my chances. Suddenly, I jumped to the left and sprinted into the woods. Jonah fired the shotgun behind me, and I felt a sharp pain all over my right side, but I didn't stop running. Behind me, I heard Jonah cursing. "Goddamn, third shot, you lucky one!" I kept moving, adrenaline pushing me forward until the pain and exhaustion forced me to stop. I realized how fortunate I was. If Jonah had been quicker, He might have hit me. I kept going through the woods until I stumbled onto someone else's property. I knocked on their door and begged for help. They answered with a shotgun too, but decided to assist me. After hours of pain and bleeding, I finally made it to the hospital. Luckily, my backpack had saved my vital organs, but some pellets were stuck deep in my skin and couldn't be removed. I came close to a terrible fate that night. If I had spent any more time lost in the woods, I might not have made it. Now I don't go hiking anymore. I stick to what I've always been good at since high school, running track. A few years ago, I had a strange experience on a snowy night in winter. The weather was really bad, with a lot of snow falling. I was driving on a quiet rural road when I saw a man standing by the side, waving at me. I looked around, but there was no car or anything nearby. I wondered why he was out there in such terrible weather without a vehicle. I felt worried, so I slowed down and rolled down my window to see if he needed help. The man walked over, visibly shivering, and told me he needed a ride to the gas station. He looked sad and wasn't wearing a proper coat, which made me feel sorry for him. So I told him to get in. Once he was in the car, I noticed he kept staring at me. It wasn't just a glance. He was really intense about it, and it gave me the creeps. I tried to focus on driving, but I could feel his eyes on me, making me uncomfortable. The roads were getting slippery, and I hoped to find a gas station soon. To break the awkward silence, I tried to make small talk, but he seemed distracted and barely answered me. Then my phone rang, and it was my friend Ben calling. I answered, hoping it would help ease the tension. After a short chat with Ben, I noticed the man looked disappointed. He muttered something about wanting to be dropped off right there. I looked around and realized we were still far from any gas station, just on a lonely road surrounded by trees. Feeling uneasy, I asked him if he was sure about this. He insisted, so I pulled over, relieved but confused. He got out and walked up the road. As he turned back to look at me, he waved for me to drive away, so I did, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. But as I glanced back in my rearview mirror, I saw two other men coming out of the woods, joining him. They got into a car parked along the road that I hadn't noticed before. I drove home slowly, my mind racing with questions about what had just happened. A few weeks ago, I had a strange experience at KFC. When I was a kid, my parents would take me and my siblings there as a treat. I loved those family outings, but as I got older, I lost interest in their fried chicken. By the time I was ready to move out, I really didn't care about it at all. So, there I was, sitting in KFC with my parents, chewing on some not-so-great fried chicken. My dad went to the restroom, and I tried to talk to my mom about what they would do after I left home. Then, a man walked in who looked just like Colonel Sanders. I knew the real Colonel had been gone for a long time, but everyone in the restaurant turned to look at him. "Well, a mighty fine Friday afternoon to y'all," he said, his voice loud and cheerful. "I'm Colonel Sanders." At first, I thought it was a promotional stunt, like an actor pretending to be the mascot. But he had everyone believing it was really him. "I care a lot about the quality of my restaurants," he said. "So I'll be inspecting this place today for all you wonderful folks." He told the managers to check their computers for a special message, and the employees jumped into action. The rest of us just sat there, hoping it would end soon. But as the colonel walked around, something about him started to creep me out. He approached each table, asking how the food was, and then staring right into the customer's eyes. "Tell me, is it finger-licking good?" he asked in a low voice. Most people just said, "Or I think we're done here." But the colonel would linger, staring while he slowly licked his fingers. It was really unsettling, and I hoped he wouldn't come to our table. But of course, he did. "Well, how nice to see a young man treating his mother to dinner," he said, looking at both of us. But his gaze was focused on me, and I felt chills run down my spine. "You're a fine young man, ain't you, boy?" he said, staring at me. I tried to keep calm, but I was shaking. Thank you, sir," I managed to say. No, thank you for dining here, son," he replied, still in that creepy voice. "How's your fried chicken? Is it up to your standards?" I looked around, wishing my dad would come back, but everything felt frozen. The colonel was on his knees beside me, reaching for my hands. "Tell me now, boy," he said, his mouth open wide. Is it finger-licking good? I was frozen with fear, unsure of what to do. Just then, my dad burst back into the room. Hey, weird guy, he shouted, grabbing the colonel and pulling him away from me. The colonel fell to the floor, and my dad glared down at him, red-faced. You trying to propose to my son? Get out of here before I call the cops. The colonel didn't argue. He just laughed, stood up, and ran out the door. We quickly left the restaurant, and I decided that would be the last time I ever went to KFC. Later that weekend, my dad saw a news report about the guy who pretended to be the colonel. He had been arrested for bothering customers and even biting their fingers off. It was a chilling reminder of how close I had come to becoming one of his victims, and now, just thinking about fried chicken makes my stomach turn. This story was told to me by an old family friend named Nikki when I was a kid. She shared it often as one of those life advice stories I should remember. I've never forgotten it, and it always comes to mind whenever hitchhiking is mentioned. Honestly, it makes me feel a bit uneasy just thinking about it. Nikki grew up around the same time as my dad in the early 80s. When she was in her mid-20s, she was one of those genuinely kind people who would help anyone in need. I can totally picture her being that way when she was younger. One day, while driving into the city, a 2-hour drive from her town, Nikki saw a man walking along the road. As she got closer, he turned and stuck out his arm with his thumb up, just like a typical hitchhiker. Nikki, being so kind-hearted, pulled over to see if he needed help. She said he was polite, if a bit shy, when he asked for a ride into the city. With a smile, she opened the passenger door for him. He tossed his bag into the back seat and buckled up. They chatted pleasantly during the drive, talking about friends and the news. Nikki felt like they were really getting along, so she even bought him dinner at a pit stop a little over halfway there. He seemed awkward and flustered when she paid, but since he mentioned he was low on cash, she didn't mind at all. Once they got into the city, he thanked her over and over for the ride and the food. He asked to be dropped off downtown, and before he got out, he asked for her phone number so he could reach out someday. Nikki was thrilled and wrote it down for him. As she drove away, she felt good about having helped someone. I know you might expect something creepy to happen by now, but this is what really got to me as a kid. Everything seemed to go so well. Whenever Nikki told me the next part, she would get a crease in her forehead and a strange look in her eye. A week later, Nikki received a phone call from him. He didn't let her say anything after she said hello. Instead, he told her, "You should thank God you were raised so nicely. When I first got in your car, I planned to hurt you once we got to the pit stop. I was going to steal your car and dump you somewhere. But after you were so kind and bought me dinner, I couldn't bring myself to do it. I didn't think I could live with myself after hurting such a nice lady. Please, Nikki, never pick up another hitchhiker." Then he hung up. Nikki never heard from him again. When she tried to call the number back, she got a payphone. "So, Mr. Hitchhiker, I know I'll never meet you, but I'm going to listen to the advice you gave Nikki and never, ever pick up a hitchhiker." A few years ago, when my friends and I were around 13 or 14, we went trick-or-treating. It was our second year going without any parents, so we were excited to run around and collect candy on our own. Every year, we'd plan our route ahead of time to hit the biggest houses, hoping for full-size candy bars. That year, a new street of luxury homes had just been built, and people had moved in. We thought it would be the perfect place to start. The street wasn't far from my house, so we met there and headed out together. We stopped at a few houses along the way, just for some extra candy, before turning onto the new street. When we got there, we didn't see any other kids around. We figured we were the first ones, which got us excited, so we ran to the first house. A kind older man answered the door and gave us full-sized Hershey bars. We were off to a great start, but after that, things went downhill. The next few houses didn't answer, and neither did the ones after that. Each house on this street had huge yards, so walking between them took a few minutes. After about 10 houses with no answer, we started to feel like we were wasting time. We decided to try one more house, the biggest one we could see. The driveway was long, leading up to a large circular area in front of the house. As we walked up, I saw a woman looking at us through a small window near the door, but she quickly backed away when we made eye contact. I thought she was just waiting for trick-or-treaters, so I was glad to see someone was home. When we got to the porch, I rang the doorbell. Almost immediately, the door opened and there were two women, one older and one younger. The younger one smiled and invited us in, saying we could each pick 2 pieces of candy from a huge table they had set up inside. The table was covered with every type of candy you could imagine. We were thrilled and rushed in without thinking twice. As we were picking out our candy, I suddenly heard the door slam shut. We all turned around and saw the younger woman standing by the door, still smiling at us. She said she'd forgotten to put out some dessert and asked us to wait for just a minute. Then she walked away, and I noticed the older woman was gone too. That's when we started to panic. We could hear footsteps coming from down the hall, and something about it felt really wrong. Without saying anything, I ran to the door, opened it, and we all bolted outside. As we ran down the driveway, we could hear the woman calling for us to wait, but we didn't stop until we were back at my house. We sat on my driveway, out of breath and terrified, trying to figure out what had just happened. We thought about telling my parents, but we knew they'd be mad at us for going into a stranger's house. We had been warned about that so many times. So, we kept it to ourselves and eventually went back out to trick or treat in my neighborhood, being a lot more careful and making sure we weren't the only kids around. It was the weirdest thing that's ever happened to me on Halloween. My friends and I still talk about it every year, wondering what those women were planning and what would have happened if we had stayed for the dessert. A few months ago, I started my job as a police officer. Since I was new, I got assigned to work overnight shifts, which meant working 3 12-hour shifts a week. It was tough, especially since a lot of the worst incidents happened at night. I've only been on the job for 3 months, and I already have a story that feels like a nightmare. One night, while I was on patrol, it was around 2 or 3 in the morning. There were no cars on the road, and most of my route was dark because our town has a lot of trees. The only well-lit street was Warren Street, thanks to the streetlights. All the stores were closed, so there wasn't much going on. As I turned onto Warren Street from a quieter road, I drove slowly, keeping an eye on both sides of the street. When I passed a coffee shop, something caught my attention. I slammed on the brakes and backed up until I was in front of the shop. I rolled down my window and leaned out to make sure I wasn't seeing things. The lights in the coffee shop were on, which was strange since it always closed at 6 p.m. on weekdays. I knew this because I was a regular customer and knew the owner well. Feeling curious and a bit worried, I parked at the curb and decided to check the door. To my surprise, it was unlocked. I pushed the heavy glass door open and stepped inside, calling out the owner's name. My voice echoed in the empty shop, which felt eerie. I wondered why the lights were on and where the owner might be. I kept calling out until I heard a sound coming from the basement. I didn't even know the coffee shop had a basement until that night. I found the door leading downstairs to a dark area. I pulled out my flashlight and pointed it down the stairs. Deep down, I knew it was my job to check it out, even though I was scared. There wasn't a light switch, so I carefully walked down the concrete stairs, barely able to see beyond the narrow beam of my flashlight. At the bottom, I entered a pitch-black basement. Then I heard the sound again, only this time it was louder. It was a strange noise that sounded half electronic and half organic, and I couldn't describe it. The sound came from a back room. I stepped into the back room, which looked like an office. I stood there, waiting for the noise to happen again. After about 30 seconds, the same awful sound erupted from a corner of the room. It seemed to be coming from inside an air vent. I first tried shining my light into the vent, but the grill blocked the light. So I put my ear up to it to listen. I heard something that sounded like breathing. My heart started racing. I angled the flashlight differently and pressed my eye against the vent grill. The light hit the vent just right, and I saw a glove inches from my face. I pulled out my gun and shouted for the person to come out, but the vent door was screwed on tight. I could hear the person moving away through the vents until the sound disappeared. I had so many questions. Where did the vent lead? How did they get in there? And why were they in there? I called for backup and we did a thorough search. The owner showed up around 4 a.m. to help us look around. There were no signs of breaking in, no unscrewed vents, and no broken windows. After a few hours, we concluded that whoever was in the vents was gone. What scares me the most is the sounds I heard that night. Not just the breathing, but that strange noise echoing through the vents. Even now, I can't shake the memory of that night. A few years ago, I stayed in a hotel with my best friend Emily. It was the second night of our trip, and we chose a hotel just outside the city because it was cheaper. The area looked nice. Late that night, Emily and I decided to go to a gas station for snacks, but then her boyfriend called her. They started talking, so I went by myself. The hotel was near some businesses, but they were all closed at that hour. The gas station was the only place open. I left the hotel and walked down the sidewalk. It took about 5 minutes, and I didn't see anyone outside. When I got to the gas station, there were about 10 people inside. It was bigger than most gas stations, with lots of snacks and drinks. I spent a few minutes picking out what I wanted, then I checked out. Inside, everything seemed normal. No one looked suspicious. But when I stepped outside, I heard the door open behind me. A man came out right after me, but I didn't think much of it at the time. As I walked back to the hotel, I noticed the man was following me. I glanced back and saw he was wearing a gray sweatshirt and a winter hat. He kept walking behind me, and I started to feel nervous because the road was quiet at that hour. When I got to the hotel parking lot, the man was still behind me. I went into the lobby, and he followed me inside. I didn't want to take the elevator, so I decided to use the stairs, thinking he would probably take the elevator. But he followed me to the stairs. I let the door close behind me, but I quickly heard it open again. I knew he was following me up. I texted Emily, asking her to open the door when I got to our room. Thankfully, she saw my message right away. I climbed the stairs to our room on the 3rd floor, feeling more anxious with every step. When I reached our floor, I let the stairwell door close behind me and heard it open again. The man was still coming after me. I picked up my pace as I got closer to our room, and I could hear his footsteps getting louder. I didn't dare look back. Finally, I saw our door open slightly, with Emily holding it. I rushed in and slammed the door shut behind me. It automatically locked, but I also secured it with the extra lock. I looked through the peephole and saw the man walk up to our door, then slowly walk away. A few seconds later, he came back and knocked on the door. There was no way I was going to answer it. I moved away from the door, and Emily, confused, asked what was happening. The man knocked one more time about a minute later, then finally walked away for good. I told Emily everything. I was so relieved she was there to let me in. If she hadn't been, I would have had to unlock the door myself with the key, which would have slowed me down and given the man a chance to catch up. I still don't know who that guy was or why he followed me, but I'm pretty sure he wasn't staying at our hotel. When I was a kid, I lived with my parents in a small neighborhood. Halloween wasn't really big for us, no trick-or-treating, so we always did something different. One thing I loved doing with my dad was exploring creepy or abandoned places. It's funny because I'd never do something like that on my own or even with friends, but with him I felt safe. I wasn't scared of what we might find, at least not until this one time. One Halloween, after driving around for a while, we found an old, worn-down barn. It must have been abandoned for years. The siding was falling apart and the roof had caved in. If it weren't for a few bits of faded red paint, you'd never know it was once a red barn. We carefully stepped through broken glass and old wood, looking at forgotten tools and trash. Then I saw it, a little scarecrow propped up against the side of the barn. I pointed it out, and my dad led the way toward it. But the closer we got, the stronger the smell became. "Poor guy," I heard my dad say, and I looked down. There was a big raccoon lying still near the scarecrow's feet. "What do you think killed it?" I asked. He bent down to take a closer look while I kept my eyes on the scarecrow. But then I froze. The scarecrow was looking right at me. I was sure it had been staring off into the distance before, but now its eyes had moved, locking onto me. It was still sitting upright, still smiling, but those eyes. "Dad," I called out, but he didn't answer. I looked over at him, and he had a disgusted expression on his face as he pointed at the raccoon. I glanced down at it again and saw what he was looking at. The raccoon's insides were gone, completely missing. But the weird thing was, there wasn't much of a mess. You'd think it would be all torn up, but unless you looked closely, you wouldn't notice anything was wrong. I didn't want to, but I looked back up at the scarecrow. My stomach dropped. It was still staring at me, but now its eyebrows were furrowed and its smile was gone. I started noticing dark, scattered stains on its clothes, like dried blood. I felt sick and dizzy until I felt my dad's hand on my shoulder. "Probably just a coyote," he said, leading us out of the barn. His words made me feel better, but I wasn't sure if I believed it. As we walked away, I glanced back at the scarecrow. It was back to the way it was, smiling, staring off into the distance, eyebrows high like before. I didn't tell my dad what I saw. I wasn't sure if it was even real, and I didn't want him to think I was seeing things. If he did, maybe he wouldn't take me on our adventures anymore. A few days later, my dad went back to the barn with my brother to sketch it. When he got back, he showed me the pictures he drew, but in them, there was no scarecrow at all. That's what creeped me out the most. This scary situation happened to me many summers ago. At the time, I was living in low-income housing funded by the government. I had just graduated from college and didn't have much money, so I qualified for a small 2-story unit. The housing was set up like a row of motels, and I shared walls with my neighbors on both sides. One night, I got off work at 11 p.m. and came home. I made something quick to eat and hopped in the shower, getting ready for bed. I had only been in the shower for about 5 minutes when I heard banging at my front door downstairs. I quickly dried off, threw on some clothes, and went downstairs cautiously. As I rounded the corner, I was blinded by a bright light and heard someone yell, "Put your hands up!" A policeman was pointing a gun at me through the glass door. Terrified, I threw my hands up and followed their instructions. After I opened the door, they had to calm me down because I was so shaken by the gun being pointed at me. They explained they were looking for someone suspected of murder. Apparently, the police had gotten a call from a witness saying the suspect had been trying to get into units in my building, and they thought my place was one of them. They asked to search my apartment, but I was exhausted and ready for bed. I told them I had been home for over an hour and everything was fine. They apologized for scaring me and moved on to check the other units. By now, it was after midnight, and I went to bed, falling asleep quickly after all the excitement. But I woke up later, not sure why at first. I checked my phone. It was around 3:30 a.m. Just as I was about to fall back asleep, I heard some strange noises coming from the bedroom across the hall. That room used to belong to my old roommate, but they had moved out months ago, so I mainly used it for storage. The noises were quiet but persistent. Since the walls were thin, I wasn't sure if the sounds were coming from the spare bedroom or the neighbor's apartment next door. I had to use the bathroom anyway, so I got up and walked into the hallway. Standing outside the spare bedroom, I said hello in my normal voice. The noises stopped immediately, which convinced me that someone was in there. Remembering the police visit earlier, I panicked. I ran back to my bedroom and locked the door, then called 911. While I was on the phone with the dispatcher, I heard the spare bedroom door slam open and someone sprint down the stairs and out the back door. I never found out if the police caught the suspect, but the next morning, I saw that the screen on one of my back windows had been cut open. That's how the person had gotten inside. I still wonder what they were doing in my apartment all night. Maybe they planned to hide out until I left for work the next day, but I'll never know for sure. Ever since then, I've always double-checked that all my windows are locked before I leave my house. Back in high school, I used to make extra money over the summer by house-sitting for my aunt and uncle. They were pretty well off and traveled a lot, so I'd watch their house and take care of their cats. One weekend, they went on a short trip, and I was staying at their place for a few days. It was a Saturday night, and my friend Tyler was celebrating his birthday. Our group went out for dinner, and afterward, everyone wanted to hang out. I offered to have them come over to my aunt and uncle's house since we couldn't go to anyone else's place because of their parents being home. Plus, my aunt and uncle's house was perfect for a get-together. We spent the night playing card games and drinking games, just having fun. By around 2 a.m., people started heading out. Thankfully, a few friends stayed sober, so everyone had a ride home and nobody had to stay over. After saying goodbye, I went to the kitchen to clean up a bit. Just a few minutes after everyone left, the doorbell rang. I figured one of my friends must have forgotten something, so I went to the door without thinking much about it. But when I opened the door, nobody was there. I was pretty buzzed, so I shrugged it off, thinking they were pulling a prank on me. I yelled out, "Real funny, guys! Go home!" and went back inside to crash on the couch. Later that night, I woke up to the doorbell ringing again, but this time it was nonstop, like 4 or 5 times in a row. I was irritated and groggy, and I had a feeling it wasn't my friends this time. I didn't open the door but peeked out through the curtains. My aunt and uncle lived in a nicer, quiet area with big yards and not many streetlights, so it was pitch dark outside. I couldn't see anyone. I thought about calling the police, but hesitated in case it really was my friends just messing with me. So, I went back to bed and didn't hear anything for the rest of the night. The next morning, I texted my friends in our group chat, asking if anyone had pranked me by ringing the doorbell. They all swore they went straight home after the party. Feeling a bit uneasy, I finished cleaning up the mess from the night before. When I went to leave, I noticed a piece of paper taped to the front door. The note said, "If you want a really fun night, leave the door unlocked next time." That freaked me out. I wasn't sure if it was some weird prank or something more serious, but either way, it was creepy. When my aunt and uncle got back, I told them everything. I also asked if I could skip staying overnight the next time I house sat for them. They ended up installing a Ring doorbell camera after that, and nothing strange has happened since. But whenever I house sit for them now, I still feel a little nervous, especially when it's dark out. My husband and I have been living in our house for about 5 years now. We live in a big town, but our place is on the edge, so we have a bigger property with lots of trees around. It feels a bit like a cabin in the woods, and there's plenty of space for our 2 German shepherds to run around. We do have neighbors, but they're about 500 feet away, and the trees give us a nice sense of privacy. One rainy Thursday night, my husband went to play poker with some friends. It was just a casual game at one of his buddies' houses, about 10 minutes away. I was home alone with the dogs, watching Netflix and enjoying some ice cream. After an episode ended, I noticed the rain had let up a bit, so I got up to let the dogs out into the backyard. Normally, I'd go outside with them, but since it was still drizzling, I just stood by the window and watched. The dogs usually do their business quickly, but this time, they were hanging around the old shed near the woods. They started barking like crazy at the shed and wouldn't stop. I figured they might have found an animal trapped near the shed, so I went out onto the patio and called for them to come inside, but they ignored me and kept barking. I went back inside, grabbed a rain jacket, flashlight, and my shoes, and headed out to see what was going on. As I got closer to the shed, a terrible smell hit me. It smelled like something had died. I was about 20 feet away from the shed when suddenly the door flew open. A small, dirty-looking man jumped out. He was only about 5 feet tall, dressed in rags with messy hair, and he reeked. He had one of our shovels in his hand and took a few swings at my dogs, trying to hit them, but luckily he missed. For a split second, he looked me right in the eyes, then dropped the shovel and took off running into the woods behind my house. Shaken, I ran back inside, called the police, and then called my husband, telling him to come home right away. The cops showed up fast and searched the woods behind my house. They ended up finding the man hiding in some bushes near my neighbor's place. A few days later, we found out he was a homeless man who had been living in people's sheds and garages around town. I'm so thankful my dogs were with me that night. I don't know what would have happened if I had to confront that man without them. This happened a few years ago when I was in college. I was a junior at a big university and living with 4 friends I met in the dorms. We had rented this old 3-story house just off campus. It wasn't in the best shape, like most college houses, but we didn't care because the rent was cheap when split between all of us. Plus, it was a short walk to campus. One night, I was home alone. All my roommates had gone out to the bars, but I didn't feel like going. I didn't enjoy bars much anyway, so I decided to stay in, watch a movie, and hang out on my phone. My room was on the 3rd floor, and everything was quiet until about midnight when I heard the stairs creaking. Someone was moving around on the 2nd floor below me. In this old house, you could hear everything, floorboards creaking and stairs making noise when someone walked. Normally, when my roommates came back from the bars, they'd be loud, talking and laughing, so it was strange that this time I didn't hear anyone speaking. I started to feel uneasy because we usually left the front door unlocked. I got out of bed and walked to the top of one of the 2 staircases. I wanted to see who was downstairs, but as soon as I moved, the person below stopped. It got quiet. I didn't want to say anything or make a sound, so I just stood there, frozen at the top of the stairs. After a few minutes that felt like forever, the person started walking again, heading up the other staircase at the end of the hall. I stood where I was, watching, and a man who looked to be in his 50s or 60s appeared. He stopped when he saw me. He had a raspy voice and said he used to live here and was just checking the place out. I didn't believe him. I told him to leave the house or I was calling the cops. That made him mad. He started cussing at me and moving toward me down the hall. I bolted down the stairs in front of me and grabbed my phone to call the cops. As I was talking to them, I had to keep moving around the house, trying to avoid the man. It was like playing a game of cat and mouse. Whenever he went up or down one stairway, I'd go the opposite direction. I could hear him based on the creaks of the floor and stairs. Whenever he stopped, I'd stop too. After what felt like forever, I finally heard him go back down to the 1st floor and leave through the back door. The cops arrived soon after. I described the man to them, and they said they'd keep an eye out for him. From then on, my roommates and I made sure the doors were always locked. One of my roommates later noticed that some cash had been stolen from his room, but other than that, everything was fine. We stayed in that house for the rest of the year and never saw the man again. Every year, the village I live in has a weekend festival in the fall. It's kind of like a mini fair, with vendor tents, food trucks, live music, and all that. The festival is held in a big park, which happens to be right next to my house. I've lived here alone for a while now, and 2 years ago, during the festival, something creepy happened. It was the first night of the festival, a Friday, and I was sitting on my balcony watching the fireworks like I do every year. The light from the fireworks lit up my backyard, and that's when I saw a hooded figure coming up the path from the park. At first, I thought it was just someone from the festival taking a shortcut through my yard to get home, but I was surprised when they turned sharply into my yard and walked right up to one of my downstairs windows, peeking inside. I was still on the balcony, and it didn't seem like they noticed me. I watched as they moved around to the door beneath my balcony and tried to open the screen door. Luckily, it was locked. I shouted at them to get out of here, using a few choice words, and the hooded figure ran off into the park. Exactly 1 year later, on the same Friday night of the festival, I went to the festival and then watched the fireworks from my balcony like usual. The fireworks ended around 11 p.m., and I went to bed not long after. I was sound asleep when I was woken up by the sound of my screen door opening again. This time, I quietly went downstairs to check it out. I didn't see anyone by the door, but as I turned to go back upstairs, I froze. There, standing outside my living room window, was a hooded figure, staring straight at me. I couldn't see much detail, but I could tell it was a man. What really scared me was that he didn't flinch or try to hide when he saw me looking at him. He just kept staring. I immediately thought about what had happened the year before. This time, I had my phone on me, so I called the police right away. As I was talking to them, the man finally disappeared from view. The cops arrived shortly after, but by then, there was no sign of him. I explained to them that this had happened the year before, on the exact same night, and I was sure it was the same person. Unfortunately, there wasn't much they could do. Now, the festival is coming up again in a couple of weeks. I've already arranged for a friend to stay with me that night because I'm on edge about it happening for a third year in a row. I just hope this year will be different. Back when I was in high school, something really scary happened. I lived with my parents, my brother, and our 2 dogs. Most days, someone would take the dogs for a walk, either me, my brother, or my parents. One night, around 8 p.m., the sun was setting, and my parents decided to walk the dogs since my brother was at a friend's house. I stayed home because I was struggling with my homework. Our neighborhood was pretty quiet and big, with lots of streets and houses. There was also a park nearby, so sometimes the walks would take anywhere from 20 minutes to over an hour. I was in my bedroom when my parents told me they were leaving. I said goodbye and heard them walk out. After that, I focused on my math homework, which I was having a hard time with. I got so caught up in it that I lost track of time. Suddenly, I heard the front door downstairs open. I just assumed my parents were back, so I stayed focused on my homework. But then I realized something didn't feel right. If my parents were home, I would have heard the dogs, but I didn't. The only thing I heard was someone walking inside. No voices, no barking, just footsteps. I stopped working and went to my door to listen. It was dead silent. I knew it wasn't my parents, and it couldn't be my brother. I thought about going downstairs to check, but something in me said that was a bad idea. So I quietly closed my door and stayed in my room. At this point, I couldn't focus on anything but what I'd heard. I started wondering if I'd imagined it. Then, out of nowhere, I heard footsteps coming up the stairs. My heart was racing as the footsteps got closer and closer to my room. I was terrified that whoever it was would come in. My door didn't have a lock, so they could just walk right in if they wanted. The footsteps passed by my room and headed down the hallway. At the end of the hall was the bathroom, my parents' bedroom, and a guest room. My brother's room was across from mine. I didn't even think. I bolted. I flung my door open, sprinted down the stairs, and ran straight for the front door. I didn't look back to see who was in the house. My mind was in full panic mode. Once I was outside, I kept running until I made it to the street. I didn't know if whoever was in the house had followed me or not. Everything was a blur. As I jogged down the street, I spotted my parents walking the dogs. They saw me running and immediately asked what was going on. I told them someone had come into the house. My dad called the police, and we stayed away from the house until they arrived. Turns out, my parents had left the front door unlocked, which wasn't a big deal in our quiet neighborhood. When the police checked, whoever had been in the house was gone, and nothing was stolen. After that, we always made sure to lock our doors. In the weeks that followed, there were 2 burglaries reported just a few blocks away. I always wondered if it was the same person who had come into our house. A guy was caught in connection with the burglaries, but I'll never know for sure if he was the one who was in our house that night. Either way, I'm just glad I got out of there when I did. There was no way I was staying in the house with someone just down the hall from me. It was one of the scariest moments of my life. A couple of years ago, something strange happened to me. At the time, I was living alone in a 1-bedroom apartment on the 2nd floor of a small building. The place wasn't very nice, and there weren't many units. I knew a few of my neighbors, but not all of them. One night, I was home by myself, like usual. I don't remember the exact time, but it was definitely nighttime when I heard a knock on my door. Without thinking too much about it, I walked over and opened the door. There stood a man who was kind of short with dark brown hair. He told me he lived down the hallway and pointed to the left. He asked if he could come into my apartment to make a phone call because his Wi-Fi wasn't working and he didn't have service on his phone. I didn't feel comfortable with this at all. I told him, sorry, but no. He said he would be quick, but I insisted that I couldn't help him. There was something about him that felt sketchy to me. After that, he turned to walk away, and I closed the door. I felt curious afterward because I had never seen him before, and I knew most of the people living in the building. I figured he would knock on someone else's door, so I quietly opened mine and peeked around the corner. I saw him walking away, all the way to the end of the hall, and then he got into the elevator. I started to think he might not even live there. I had seen almost everyone on my floor, and after he left, I went to one of my windows to look out at the guest parking lot where the main doors opened. There were assigned parking spaces under the building, but there was a small guest parking lot with about 10 spaces out front. I saw the man leave the building and walk to an older car parked in the guest lot before driving away. I realized he definitely didn't live there. So why would he lie to me? The whole thing creeped me out, especially since he wanted to come into my apartment. I figured he had made up the story about his Wi-Fi being down and his phone not working. I wasn't sure how he got into the building in the first place, but I guess someone else must have let him in when they came in. After that night, I never saw him again, which confirmed for me that he didn't live there. I was really glad I hadn't let him inside my apartment. This happened to me when I was 15 years old. I was an only child living at home with my parents. It was a Friday night, and my parents went out with some friends. They told me they'd be out late and even got some food for me before they left. I had stayed home alone a few times before, and I didn't mind it at all. By that age, I was used to it. After they left, I had dinner and finished my homework for the weekend. Then I went up to my bedroom to play video games. I was gaming for about an hour or two when I heard a sound downstairs. It was the sound of glass breaking. At first, I thought maybe a plate fell from the cabinet, but it didn't quite sound like that. I was in denial that someone could have broken in because I always thought my neighborhood was safe. After a few seconds, I realized it was possible, especially when I heard footsteps inside. I could barely hear them since they were far away, but I heard just enough to know someone was in the kitchen area, and I was upstairs in my bedroom. I ran to my door and locked it, then grabbed my phone and called 911. When the operator answered, I told her someone had broken into my house and gave her my address. She said the police would be there shortly and that she would stay on the line with me until they arrived. I spoke as quietly as I could and hid in the back corner of my bedroom under my desk, covering myself with a blanket. The woman on the other end asked if I knew where the intruder was. I tried to listen for the footsteps again, but I didn't hear anything. I honestly had no clue where the person was. They could have even left. For the next several minutes, I heard nothing. I started to feel a little better and was told the police were very close. But then, out of nowhere, I heard noises in the upstairs hallway. It sounded like the intruder had just reached the top of the stairs. The footsteps walked right outside my door and then stopped. It felt like they knew I was in there. My heart was racing when they tried to open the door. I was really glad that my door had a lock. Just then, the woman said the police were arriving. I faintly heard cars pulling into the driveway, and the footsteps upstairs quickly walked away and went back down the stairs. I stayed where I was. The police entered the house and caught the guy as he tried to leave through the back. It was a bit chaotic, and several more police cars showed up. My parents were called and came home as soon as they found out. The man who had broken in was someone I had never seen before. He looked young, tall, thin, and had long dark brown hair. I'm not sure what his intentions were or why he chose our house. The police really arrived just in time, though. Sometimes I still can't believe it happened, and I always feel lucky that it turned out as well as it did. For a little background, I live alone in a 2-bedroom house in a usually quiet neighborhood. One night I was home by myself, and it was pretty late. I was just about to go to bed and starting to feel really tired when I heard a knock at my front door. My first thought was, who could be at my door at this hour? People rarely came knocking at my door, so I felt a little uneasy. I walked to the living room, which is at the front of the house. All my windows were covered, including the one by the front door. When I got to the door, I pulled back the curtain to peek outside, but I didn't see anyone. I carefully opened the door and looked out, but no one was there. I stepped outside and looked around, but the person who knocked was gone. Then I noticed something on the ground, an envelope on the front step. I picked it up and took it inside. When I opened it, there was nothing written on the envelope, but inside was a piece of paper folded up. I unfolded it and saw a note with messy handwriting. The note mentioned my name at the beginning and was really creepy. It said that whoever wrote it knew who I was and where I lived, and I should be aware of my surroundings. They didn't directly threaten me, but the whole thing was strange. The handwriting was so sloppy that I couldn't make out some of the words. After reading it, I felt really creeped out and threw it away. I looked out of all the windows but didn't see anyone. Everything seemed quiet again. I wanted to go to bed, but I wasn't tired anymore. I went to my bedroom and turned on the TV to relax. About 3 minutes later, I heard knocking again. This time, it was coming from the back door. I immediately grabbed my phone and called the police. I explained what was happening and told them about the letter. They said someone would be there shortly. I got up and walked over to a window that looked out to the backyard, but I couldn't see anyone. The police arrived pretty quickly, but whoever knocked was gone. They searched my property and asked me a few questions, but there wasn't much they could do. I showed them the letter, but since I had never seen the person, I couldn't give a description. After the police left, I was able to fall asleep, even though it took a while. Thankfully, nothing strange happened after that night. I still wonder who did that and why. The letter was very odd. It might have just been a prank to scare me. I don't really know anyone who would do that, or why they would. I'm just glad nothing like that has happened since. This story happened a long time ago when I was 10 years old. I don't remember all the details, but I know that I was left home alone that night. I wasn't left alone very often at that age. It was probably one of the first times. My parents usually didn't leave me home alone for more than a few hours. I was an only child, and we lived in a 2-story house with all the bedrooms upstairs. It was late afternoon or early evening, and I was in my bedroom. My parents had been gone for a while when I heard a knock on the front door. Sometimes people knocked at our door, usually trying to sell something. When I got downstairs to the kitchen, I looked at the front door and saw a man standing there. We made eye contact for a second. He was wearing a black jacket and jeans and looked pretty average. I walked over to the door and opened it because I was curious about who he was. I didn't think anything could go wrong. My parents had probably told me not to talk to strangers or answer the door, but I couldn't remember. The man said hi and asked if my parents were home. I told him no, and then he asked to come inside. I remember asking him why, and he said his car broke down and he needed to make a phone call. I believed him and let him in to use the phone. When I opened the door, he walked in and headed to the kitchen where the phone was hanging on the wall. I pointed it out to him, but I also felt uneasy. I wasn't sure why I felt that way, but I did. The man picked up the phone and started dialing a number. I stood there about 10 feet away from him. The next thing I remember is him saying nobody was answering, and he hung up the phone but didn't leave. I thought he would just make the call and go, but he kept standing there. Then he started walking toward the living room in the back of the house. I wondered where he was going, and just then I heard my parents pull into the driveway. When they arrived, the man suddenly turned and ran past me to the front door. He bolted outside and sprinted through our yard, cutting through the neighbor's yard before disappearing down the street. My parents parked and came up to me, asking what was going on. They saw a guy running through the yard and wanted to know if I was okay. I told them the whole story, and they said I should never have let that man inside. I learned a valuable lesson that day. At 10 years old, I should have known better, but I didn't. I felt really lucky that my parents got home when they did. I still wonder if that man was planning to rob us or something. Luckily, I never saw him again after that. 2 summers ago, my wife and I were on a cross-country road trip, heading to a big family gathering. We decided to drive so we could stop at a few cities we liked along the way. On the first day, we drove for about 8 or 9 hours before stopping for the night. The second day, we pushed a little farther, driving late into the night. Around 11 p.m., we got off the freeway and onto a quiet highway. There were woods on both sides, and we barely saw any other cars. About 10 minutes in, We saw what looked like a man standing in the middle of the road, waving his arms. I slowed down, and as we got closer, we saw he was an older man, probably in his 70s. He looked like he needed help, so we stopped the car. He came up to my window, and I rolled it down just a bit. He seemed really worried. He told us that his car had run out of gas a little ways back on a side road, and he'd been walking trying to get home. He asked if we could drive him to his house, which he said was just a couple of miles away. My gut reaction was to say no, and honestly, I wish I had. But he looked so harmless, so I figured, why not help him out? I told him to hop in the back, and I'd give him a ride. He got in, thanked us several times, and told us his house was just up the road. He mentioned he had gas in his other truck that he could use for his car. Following his directions, we drove about a mile, then turned onto a quiet road surrounded by thick woods. After a minute or so, he pointed out a driveway and asked us to pull in. I asked if it was his driveway, and he said yes, but asked if we could drive a little farther up. The driveway was narrow and winding, and I couldn't see much because of all the trees. As we kept driving, I started to feel uneasy. Then we reached a clearing, and he said we could drop him off there. As soon as he got out of the car, I saw movement coming from the woods behind us. I glanced forward and saw more movement. Without thinking, I slammed on the gas and threw the car into reverse. My wife started screaming as multiple men came running toward us from both sides. I didn't stop. I backed out of the narrow driveway as fast as I could. One of the men hit my car with something, but I didn't care. I just kept going until we got back to the road and sped off to the highway. My wife was shaking, and honestly, so was I. I don't know what kind of trap that old man was trying to set for us, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never stop to pick anyone up again. Last year, I was on a long road trip for work. I travel a lot for my job, but I'll skip the work details and get right to the story. I left the city I was staying in around 4 p.m., knowing it would be a late-night drive. I didn't expect to get to my hotel until about 2 in the morning. At first, the roads were busy, but as the night went on, they got quieter. By the time it was around 1 in the morning, I was about an hour and a half away from my destination, driving through the middle of nowhere. The roads were almost empty, and I was feeling good, just cruising along. That's when I noticed a car coming up fast behind me. I was already in the right lane, so I figured it would pass by, but instead, it slowed down to match my speed. I glanced over and saw that it was an old, beat-up car with duct tape on one of the windows. What caught my attention more was the driver. He was wearing a skeleton mask. He looked right at me for a second, then sped up and moved ahead, getting about 5 car lengths in front of me. I shook it off, thinking it was weird, but kept driving. Soon, more cars started appearing in my rearview mirror, also moving quickly. The first one passed me, and to my surprise, the driver was also wearing a skeleton mask. That car lined up beside the one in front of me, and then another car passed. Same thing, another skeleton mask. Now, I was getting really freaked out. When I looked behind me, I saw even more cars, all with skeleton mask drivers. I was completely surrounded. I had no idea what was going on or what they wanted. Were they trying to mess with me? Run me off the road? As I kept driving, the cars seemed to get closer. I didn't know what to do, but I hoped an exit would show up soon. After what felt like forever, I finally saw one coming up. I kept my speed steady, and at the last second, I swerved onto the exit ramp. The cars in front of me couldn't make the turn, so I was able to get away, but a bunch of them followed me off the highway. Now, there were about 5 cars still trailing me. One started speeding up, trying to pass. As I frantically looked around, we passed a restaurant and a few businesses, and then I saw a gas station. To my relief, there was a police car parked there. Without thinking twice, I swerved into the station and parked right next to the cop car. A few of the skeleton mask cars pulled in, but they quickly drove through and left. I waited for the officer to come out of the store. When he did, I told him everything. He said he would alert the other police in the area, and even offered to drive a few miles behind me to make sure I wasn't followed again. That's exactly what we did, and I made it to my hotel safely about an hour later. A few years ago, I was on a cross-country road trip because I was moving from one side of the country to the other. It was just me, traveling alone, and I kind of liked living out of my car for a bit. The only issue was that my car was old and barely hanging on. I had planned to buy a new car after the move since I didn't want the hassle of dealing with it right away. For the first part of the trip, the car did okay, but it would sometimes give me trouble. On the third day, it was really hot, and I had been driving almost non-stop for about 10 hours. As night fell, I was driving on a quiet highway, not a main freeway, just one of those roads surrounded by woods. Suddenly, I felt my car start to die. It was about 9 p.m., and the road was empty. I pulled over, hoping the car would start again if I let it rest for a bit. After a few minutes, I tried turning it back on, but nothing happened. I took out my phone to call for help, but of course, I had no service. I didn't know what to do, so I decided to walk a little up the road to see if I could get any signal. As I walked about 20 feet away from the car, checking my phone for bars, I heard a noise coming from the woods. At first, I thought it might be a deer, but when I looked closer, I saw the legs of a man standing behind the trees. I couldn't see much of him, and I had no idea why someone would be out in the woods at that time. It made me feel uneasy, so I quickly walked back to my car, got in, locked the doors, and tried to stay calm. I kept checking my phone, hoping it would get service, and decided to restart it just in case. While I was waiting for it to reboot, I suddenly heard a noise coming from the right side of my car. I looked over and my heart dropped. A man was standing at my passenger window, staring in. He was dirty, shirtless, and looked like he had been in the woods for a while. He started trying to open the door, and when it didn't budge, he began banging on the window. I was frozen in fear at first, but eventually started yelling at him to leave. He didn't seem to care. I tried using my phone again to call the police, but I still had no service. Suddenly, the man stopped banging, ran back toward the woods, and picked up a large stick. He started walking back toward my car. I was terrified and thought about getting out to run, but I didn't have a plan. I just knew I didn't feel safe inside the car anymore. Just as I was about to open my door, I saw bright headlights behind me. A truck pulled up and parked. I rushed over to it, and a big man wearing a camo jacket got out. He asked if I needed help, but before I could answer, he saw the man with the stick coming toward my car. I quickly told him that the guy had been trying to break in. The man from the truck didn't hesitate. He reached under his seat, pulled out a gun, and yelled at the shirtless guy to back off. As soon as the man saw the gun, he dropped the stick and raised his hands in the air. The guy from the truck handed me his phone and told me to call the police. Thankfully, he had service. We waited there until the cops arrived. They took the shirtless guy away, and I got my car towed. I spent the night at a nearby hotel and got my car fixed the next day. As soon as I got to my new place, I sold that car. That night was one of the scariest experiences of my life. A couple of years ago, I was driving to pick up my girlfriend from her job. Her car was in the shop, so I offered to drive her home after her late shift, which ended around 11 p.m. It was about a 20-minute drive to get there, and after she got in my car, we started heading back. The roads were super quiet since it was so late. About halfway home, my car, an older one that had been acting up, suddenly broke down. I tried restarting it several times, but nothing worked. It was just us, stuck on the side of a dark and empty road. A few cars passed by in the first 5 minutes, but we didn't know anyone nearby to call for help. So we decided to call roadside assistance, but they told us it would be a 45-minute wait. Not ideal, but at least help was on the way. We were on a quiet stretch of road, surrounded by wilderness. It was pitch black, and the only light came from our phones and the occasional car passing by. We were just talking and scrolling through our phones, trying to pass the time, when we saw headlights approaching from behind. We didn't think much of it until we noticed the car was moving really slowly. It turned out to be an old, creepy-looking white van from the 80s. I made a joke about it to my girlfriend, but I couldn't help wondering why it was driving so slowly. The van passed us and disappeared around the corner. A few minutes later, we saw headlights again. Sure enough, it was the same white van, moving just as slowly as before. I made another comment about it, feeling a little uneasy, but it passed us, and vanished again. Then, after a couple of minutes, we saw the same van for the third time. This time, it was going even slower. I tried to lighten the mood by joking that it was AAA finally showing up, but I was getting really nervous. As the van passed us once more, it started pulling over to the side of the road, about 40 feet in front of us. It just sat there and nobody got out. I was freaking out inside. I tried starting my car again, desperate to get out of there, but nothing happened. The van stayed there for what felt like forever, and then the driver's door finally opened. A man stepped out but didn't come toward us right away. Instead, he walked around to the passenger side of the van and stood there, almost hiding. I could barely see him. After a couple of minutes, he started walking toward us. My heart was pounding, and I had no idea what to do. I was scared out of my mind. Then, out of nowhere, I saw headlights from another car coming up behind us. Without even thinking, I jumped out of my car and stood in the middle of the road, waving my arms to get the driver to stop. As the car slowed down, I heard a noise behind me and turned to see the man getting back into his van. He quickly drove off after that. The car that had slowed down drove past us, probably thinking I was crazy, but at least the creepy van was gone. My girlfriend and I sat in the car, nervous that the van might come back, but thankfully it didn't. A few more cars passed, and eventually, the roadside assistance arrived and towed my car. I still think about that night and wonder what the guy in the van was planning to do. Back when I was in college, I worked at a shoe store in a strip mall during the summers while staying at my parents' house. One night, I was closing up the store by myself since I had been there for a while, and they trusted me. We closed at 10 p.m., and after finishing everything, I headed out to the parking lot. It was almost empty by then, and my car was parked far away because the lot had been busy when I got there. I got into my car, but when I tried to start it, it wouldn't start. The engine made a weird sound, but it wouldn't turn over. I didn't know much about cars, so I called my dad to tell him what was going on. He said he'd be there in about 30 minutes to check it out, so I sat in the car and waited. The parking lot was completely quiet, with only a few cars parked far away. I passed the time scrolling through my phone. After a few minutes, I looked up and saw a man walking through the parking lot. He was wearing a hood and kept his head down. At first, it seemed like he was coming towards my car, but then he changed direction and wandered around for a bit before disappearing behind the building. He seemed a little off, like he didn't have anywhere specific to go, and the way he glanced at my car made me nervous. A few minutes passed, and I realized I really had to use the restroom. There was a gas station nearby, so I decided to walk there, even though I was a little worried about that guy. But he'd been gone for a while, so I figured it was fine. The walk took about 10 minutes, and I didn't see anyone along the way. I quickly used the restroom and headed back. When I got close to the store, I saw my car still sitting in the parking lot, but I also saw the same guy. He was standing next to my car, trying to open the door and hitting the window. I froze for a second, watching from a distance, but then he noticed me. He stopped what he was doing and started walking toward me. I panicked and backed away, going around the building to try to lose him. But he kept following me. I made a full lap around the building, and when I came around the front again, I saw my dad pulling into the parking lot in his truck. I started running toward him, but the guy started running after me. He was fast, and I knew I wouldn't make it to the passenger seat in time. So instead, I jumped into the back of my dad's truck just as the guy reached us. Luckily, my dad knew something was wrong and hit the gas. The man tried to grab the truck, but we were already speeding away. He chased us for a few moments, but we were too fast, and he couldn't keep up. Once we were a safe distance away, my dad pulled over, and I climbed into the passenger seat. We called the cops and headed back to the parking lot, but the man was gone. When we checked my car, there were dents all over it. He must have kicked or hit it with something. I was really angry about the damage, but the car was old anyway, and I ended up getting a new one not long after that. When I was 19, I had a job where I worked really late nights. I don't work there anymore, but I miss it sometimes because it was fun, except for one scary night. It was a Thursday, and I got off work around midnight. The drive home usually took about 15 minutes. I lived with my parents at the time, so I was headed there. A few minutes into my drive on a quiet road, my car started smoking. I pulled over, not knowing what was wrong, and turned the car off. Almost right after I stopped, a pickup truck pulled over behind me. I figured the driver must have seen the smoke and wanted to help. A man got out of the truck and walked toward me. He was a bigger guy, probably a bit older than me. I got out of my car and said hi, and he seemed friendly right away. He asked if I was okay and what happened with my car. I told him I didn't know, and he said I couldn't drive it like that. Then he offered to give me a ride to my parents' house. Looking back, I know it was a dumb decision, but he seemed nice, and I didn't think anything bad would happen. So I got into his truck. He kept chatting, asking where I worked, and other small talk. I told him my address, and he said he knew where it was. But after about 10 minutes, I noticed he missed the turn. When I pointed it out, he said, "Oh, I just need to make a quick stop. You don't mind, right?" That's when I started feeling uneasy. It was after midnight, and we were driving through the middle of nowhere. What kind of stop could he need to make at this hour? I pulled out my phone to call my parents, but when I did, he asked, "What are you doing?" I said I was going to text my mom, but he cut me off and asked what kind of phone I had. I told him it was an iPhone, and he asked to see it. When I held it up, he grabbed it from my hand and threw it out the window. I was in shock and asked him what he was doing, but he didn't answer. That's when I knew I was in serious trouble. We drove in silence for a while down random, dark country roads. Eventually, he stopped at the end of a long driveway that led into the woods. He got out of the truck and told me to get out too. I was terrified. He came around to my side and grabbed my arm, trying to lead me up the driveway. I didn't think I could fight him. He was much bigger than me. But as we started walking, I kicked him as hard as I could in the groin. He let go and fell to the ground, and I took off running. I didn't stop, even though I had no idea where I was. I ran through the woods until I came out onto another quiet road. Just when I thought I was out of options, I saw headlights. I ran into the middle of the road, waving my arms like crazy. Thankfully, the car that pulled up was a police car. I felt instant relief. The officer stopped, and I told him what happened. He called for backup, and when we went back to the driveway where the man's truck was, he was gone. The police took me home and asked me more questions. Eventually, they found the guy who had picked me up. It was the scariest experience of my life. A couple of years ago, one morning, I was getting ready to leave for work. I had a typical office job and lived in a house just outside the city. I went out to my car in my detached garage, but when I tried to start it, nothing happened. This was weird because my car had been working fine up until then, and it wasn't that old. It had even run well the day before. Since I didn't have time to figure out what was wrong, I called a Lyft to get to work. Thankfully, I lived close enough to the city that it wasn't hard to find one, and I made it to work on time. The rest of the day was pretty normal. After work, I took another Lyft home, and when I got back, I decided to check on my car and see what was going on. I went out to the garage, popped the hood, and looked at the engine. Even though I'm not a mechanic, I could tell something was wrong. Someone had tampered with it. I had no idea who would do that or why. I was standing there, frustrated, trying to figure it all out, when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. Down beneath some shelves in the garage, I saw a man hiding, watching me. As soon as he realized I saw him, he started moving. My only instinct was to get away. He stood up, and I saw he was holding a hammer. That's when I knew I had to run. I bolted out of the garage and ran around to my house, locking the door behind me. The man reached the door seconds later and tried to open it. When he realized it was locked, he started banging on the window with the hammer. I grabbed my phone and called 911, telling them what was happening. I ran to the back of the house, trying to stay as far away from the front as possible. It wasn't long before I heard glass shattering. The man had broken a window. I could hear him making a lot of noise at the front door, and soon after, I knew he was inside the house. At that point, I slipped out the back door, running into my backyard and through my neighbor's yard. making my way to the street. I just wanted to get as far away from him as I could. I didn't hear or see him anymore. While talking to the police on the phone, I kept walking around the street, keeping an eye out for him. After about 10 minutes, the police finally arrived. I went back and met them, and they entered my house through the open front door. I stayed outside with other officers while they checked the place. After a few minutes, they came out with the man in handcuffs. He was arrested right there. I think he must have been on drugs or something because he seemed completely out of it. When I went back inside, I saw that he had smashed up a lot of things. It looked like he had taken the hammer to almost everything. Thankfully, I had insurance, so I didn't have to pay too much for the repairs, but it still took a while to fix everything. I'm just glad he didn't hurt me. I still don't know how he got into my garage or how long he had been hiding there. It's scary to think he might have been there when I tried to start my car that morning. This happened when I was 16 years old, just after I got my first job at a restaurant. My parents let me use their old car, which wasn't in great shape. It had broken down once before, but we managed to get it running again, and for a few weeks, it worked fine. I used it to drive to school and work. One night, after working late, I started driving home. It usually took about 15 minutes, and we lived in a rural area, so the roads were quiet with just woods on both sides. Out of nowhere, the car began losing power and eventually died. I pulled over to the side of the road and tried starting it again, but nothing happened. It was the same issue as before when it broke down. I took out my phone to call my parents, but realized it was dead, and since the car had no power, I couldn't charge it. I didn't know what to do. There were no businesses nearby, just some private properties. But it was late, and I didn't think it was a good idea to go knock on anyone's door. I hoped my parents would realize I hadn't made it home and come looking for me, since they knew the car could break down. Sitting there, it started to feel a little spooky. The woods were dark and quiet, except for the sound of crickets, the occasional owl, and the wind in the trees. I didn't want to get out of the car. After about 10 minutes, while I was looking around, I saw something that made my heart race. A man standing in the woods, half hidden behind a tree. He had a beard, and he was just standing there, watching me. I was so creeped out. I had no idea what to do, and I couldn't understand why someone would be out there in the woods at this hour. He stood there for over a minute, just staring at me. Then he disappeared back into the trees. Even though he was gone, I was still scared. I kept looking around, expecting him to come back. After about 10 more minutes, just as I started to feel a bit calmer, I looked again, and there he was. This time, he was walking toward me. My heart was pounding as I watched him come all the way to the edge of the road, less than 10 feet from my car. The man walked over to the passenger side and tried to open the door. Then he calmly walked around to the driver's side and tried that door too. I was terrified. I ducked down, covered my face with my hands, and didn't want to look. He kept poking around the car, trying all the doors. At one point, he knocked on one of the windows, and then he started banging on my driver's side window. When I finally looked up, I saw his face staring right at me. It was the most scared I had ever been. I didn't know what he was going to do, and although my car was locked, I was afraid he might break in. After a few moments of banging on the window, the man stopped and walked to the other side of the car again. Just then, I saw headlights approaching from behind. I felt a bit of relief. As the car got closer, I heard it honking repeatedly, and then I realized it was my parents. The man saw the car and ran back into the woods. My parents pulled over behind me, and I got out and ran to them. I was so relieved to be safe. Once I got in their car, I explained what happened. They called the police and reported the man. We stayed there until the police arrived, but the man didn't come back. The officers searched the woods but couldn't find him. We also arranged for a tow truck to get my car. Even now, it creeps me out that the man got away. I still don't know where he came from or what he was doing out there, but I'm just glad I'm okay. Last year, I decided to go on a road trip to visit a couple of friends from high school who had moved to Berkeley to study at the University of California. Visiting them had become a summer tradition for me, and we were as close as brothers. Normally I'd fly, but last year I chose to drive so I could check out some parks, museums, and landmarks along the way. The first 2 days of the trip went fine. Everything was smooth. By the third day, I expected to arrive at my friend's place, but I was still driving late into the night. It must have been around 9 or 10 p.m. by then, and the roads were eerily quiet. Hardly any cars in sight, which felt both peaceful and a bit unsettling, as I've always had a small fear of empty roads. I still had a few hours to go and was eager to get to my destination. Needing a bathroom break and some coffee to stay awake, I pulled over at a small rest stop I spotted. It wasn't like the big rest stops with gas stations and truck parking. This one was just a small building with a few parking spots, perfect for a quick stop. As I parked, I noticed it was dark and no one else was around. After stretching a bit, I went inside, where I saw a hallway with a men's restroom on one side, a women's restroom on the other, and some vending machines. I was getting an energy drink from one of the machines when I noticed another car pull in and park right next to mine, even though there were plenty of open spaces. That felt a bit weird, but I shrugged it off and headed to the restroom. After a few minutes, I came back out and saw the car was still next to mine, with the headlights on, meaning the driver was still inside. Something didn't feel right, but I tried to ignore it. As I drank my Red Bull and headed towards the exit, I heard the car's engine shut off. The driver's door opened, and a tall man with a beard and a brown leather jacket stepped out. He started walking towards me, hands in his pockets, staring at me with this unsettling look. My whole body tensed up and I tried to stay calm, but I was on edge. As we passed each other, I nodded and he nodded back. But after a few steps, I heard him call out, "Hey!" I turned around to see him pointing a gun at me, a 9mm pistol aimed right at my face. "Why are you in such a hurry?" he asked with a creepy smile. I was terrified. My heart raced, but I tried to stay calm, raising my hands to show I wasn't resisting. "What do you want?" I asked. "Your watch, wallet, and phone," he said. I handed them over without hesitation, hoping it would end there. But then he motioned for me to follow him, leading me into the woods behind the building. I was panicking inside. If all he wanted was to rob me, why was he taking me into the woods? This had to be something worse. As we walked deeper into the trees, I begged him to let me go, even offering him my car. He stayed silent. After about 20 meters, he stopped and told me to turn around. I did as he said, facing him, and we were now just a few feet apart. He raised the gun, pointing it directly at my face. At that moment, I thought I was going to die. Tears streamed down my face, and my body was shaking. I closed my eyes, waiting for the shot. Then out of nowhere, bang, bang, bang! 3 gunshots rang out. I screamed and hit the ground, covering my ears. I thought I'd been shot, but I felt no pain. When I opened my eyes, I realized he hadn't shot me at all. Instead, he was standing there laughing, like it was all some kind of sick joke. "Go home, kid, and don't forget to wash your pants," he said, still laughing as he walked away. I lay there for a while, completely stunned and humiliated. Eventually, I gathered myself, went back to the building to wash my face, and got into my car. Shaken and exhausted, I drove to the nearest town, where I borrowed a phone to call the police and reported everything. I rented a room for the night, but I was still too rattled to sleep. The next day, I finally made it to my friend's house and told them everything. They couldn't believe how close I came to dying. Even though I spent a couple of weeks with them, I was still shaken up. That night haunted me for months, and to this day, I can't shake the feeling of how lucky I was to get out of that situation alive. Since then, I've never stopped at a rest stop again. My name's Dan, and I've been a truck driver for over 25 years. 4 years ago, something happened to me that I'll never forget. It changed my life. It was a rainy night, and I was driving my truck down the highway. The road was completely empty. It was about 4 a.m., and I still had 4 hours to go before reaching the company's warehouse to deliver some industrial supplies. Out of nowhere, a heavy downpour began, making it tough to see the road. But after so many years on the job, I was used to driving in bad weather. The rain didn't worry me as much as the strange feeling that started to creep in. It's hard to explain, but something didn't feel right. Maybe it was the eerie silence, or how long I'd been driving without a break. Either way, I just couldn't shake the feeling. I turned on some music to distract myself and kept driving carefully, slowing down to make sure I had control. The rain was pouring hard and the fog was getting thicker. Suddenly, through the fog, I saw the headlights of a car speeding toward me from the opposite direction. I didn't see it until it was almost right on top of me. I swerved to avoid a crash, but the wet road made me lose control. Before I knew it, my truck flipped and went off the road. I felt weightless for a second before everything went black. The sound of metal crunching was the last thing I remember. When I woke up, I was lying on the ground in the rain. My head was pounding and I couldn't move. I realized I was badly hurt. I couldn't feel my legs. I tried calling out, but my voice was too weak. I thought I was going to die there, alone in the middle of nowhere. After what felt like forever, I heard footsteps and an engine. An older man and his son found me. They called for help and stayed with me until the ambulance came. I was in and out of consciousness, but I remember the doctors saying I had broken bones, internal bleeding, and a serious head injury. They said I was lucky to be alive. The recovery was tough, so tough that there were moments I wished I hadn't survived. Weeks passed while I lay in the hospital, unable to move. I felt helpless. Then, something strange started happening. I'd wake up in the middle of the night with the feeling that someone was watching me. At first, I thought it was just the trauma from the accident, but it kept happening. One night, I saw a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was tall and dark, and I couldn't see any details. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. I was frozen with fear. The figure moved closer until I could feel its cold breath on my face. I shut my eyes, praying it would go away. When I finally opened them, it was gone. The next morning I told the nurses, but they brushed it off as sleep paralysis. But I knew what I saw. Over the next few days, the figure kept showing up. It never stopped being terrifying, but I stopped telling people about it, not wanting to sound crazy. I started thinking that maybe this figure had something to do with the accident. I did some research and found out that other drivers who had crashed on that same stretch of highway reported similar things, seeing headlights coming at them or a shadowy figure in the road. I reached out to William, the man who found me after the accident. When I asked him about that night, he said something that sent chills down my spine. He hadn't seen any other car that night. He was driving behind me when he saw my truck swerve off the road, but there was no car coming the other way. There was no car until the ambulance arrived. That's when I realized the figure I kept seeing might have caused my accident, just like it had for other drivers. But the strangest part came later. One night the figure appeared again, but this time it whispered to me. It told me its story. It was a truck driver who had died on that same highway many years ago. He had been driving in a storm when a car came at him from the other direction. He couldn't avoid the crash, and both drivers died. I was about to ask the figure more when a nurse walked in and it vanished. That was the last time I saw it. The next day, I found a news report from 35 years ago about a fatal accident on that highway. A drunk driver had been going the wrong way and hit a truck head-on, killing both drivers instantly. I realized the figure wasn't the truck driver. It was the driver of the other car. Since then, I've prayed for both of them, hoping their souls can finally rest in peace. It was August 2008, one of the hottest summers I can remember. I was driving my old cargo truck, hauling steel sheets to a construction site in southern Missouri. I had over 20 years of truck driving experience and thought I had seen it all. But what happened that day still haunts me. I was cruising down Highway 60, going through Mark Twain National Forest. It's a beautiful place during the day, but pretty creepy at night. I planned to stop at a truck stop near Springfield for a bathroom break and maybe some food before continuing my drive. A few miles before I reached the stop, I noticed an old beat-up truck on the side of the road. The hood was propped open, and as I got closer, I saw a chubby man waving his arms at me. We truck drivers have a code. We help each other out. So I slowed down, parked a bit ahead, and walked over to see if I could help. The man, about 45 years old, wore a dirty baseball flannel shirt. It was clear he had been working on his truck for hours. The sun was starting to set, and he looked relieved when I approached. "Thank God you stopped," he said, shaking my hand. He introduced himself as Neil and explained he had been stuck there for 4 or 5 hours. His truck's alternator was broken, and he asked if I could give him a ride to the nearest town to find a mechanic. He seemed harmless, and I didn't want to leave him stranded, so I told him to grab his duffel bag and hop in. As we drove, Neil was quite the talker. He told me he was from Alabama and on his way to pick up a load in St. Louis. He admitted his truck had been having problems for weeks, but he thought it would hold up. About 15 or 20 minutes into our drive, I noticed 2 cars in my rearview mirror. They were closely following each other. At first, I thought nothing of it, but they didn't try to pass us, which felt strange since we were the only ones on the road. I asked Neil if he knew them, but he didn't recognize them either. I joked if he was running from someone, and although he laughed, I could see he was getting anxious. Those cars followed us for about 10 miles without attempting to pass. It felt suspicious. Then, as we reached a stretch of road lined with woods, the cars suddenly sped up, overtook us, and blocked the road. I slammed on the brakes, thinking, "What the hell?" As they came to a stop in front of us, 3 men stepped out, all armed, and headed straight for my truck. My heart raced as I noticed Neil go pale and start sweating. I whispered for him to stay calm and instinctively reached under my seat for my gun, only to remember I had left it at home. My company had recently cracked down on carrying firearms, so I didn't have it on this trip. The men positioned themselves at both doors, guns drawn. One of them shouted for us to get out of the truck. I raised my hands, trying to stay calm. "You can take whatever you want," I said, but the man shouted again for us to get out. We slowly complied, and as Neil climbed out, he stumbled and nearly fell. The men ordered us to the side of the road and told us to empty our pockets. We handed over our wallets, phones, and keys. "You can take the truck. Just let us go," I pleaded, but the man snapped at me to shut up. After taking our belongings, he threw my truck keys back at me and told me to start the engine. Confused, I looked at Neil, who seemed just as bewildered. Then the man ordered me back into the truck, while one of the others told Neil to get into one of their cars. I didn't know what they were planning, but with guns pointed at us, I had no choice. I started the truck and we drove again, with one car in front carrying Neil and the other following behind. We left the highway and took a narrow dirt road deeper into the woods. I racked my brain for a way out, but there wasn't one. Even if I escaped, I couldn't leave Neil behind. The trees closed in as we drove further into the woods until we reached a small clearing. Both cars stopped and the men got out, still holding their guns. They ordered me out of the truck and my hands shook as I complied. Dread filled me. If they brought us this far, it couldn't be for anything good. The leader signaled for me to follow him into the woods, where Neil was being led by a short, stocky guy with a devilish grin. He flashed me a sinister smile as we continued walking until we reached an old, abandoned cabin. Fear twisted my stomach as they shoved us inside. The place was filthy, filled with garbage and old furniture. They ordered us to sit on a dusty couch. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to sound steady. The stocky guy smiled again and said in a low voice, "Just make sure you don't go running to the police." His companions chuckled as they tied our hands and feet, making jokes the whole time, and then they left, slamming the door behind them. As soon as they were gone, I started struggling to loosen the ropes, telling Neil we had to get out of there. He looked pale and shaky, whispering, "They're going to kill us, aren't they?" I tried to sound confident, though fear gripped me too. "Not if we get out first," I said, working furiously to free my wrists. Finally, I managed to loosen the knots and untie Neil. "Thanks, buddy," he muttered, trying to keep things light. I replied, "Save it for when we're actually safe." We stumbled out of the cabin into the dark woods. The cars and my truck were gone, but we had no choice but to head in the opposite direction of the cabin, hoping to find the road. We eventually made it to the road, terrified the men might come back, but we couldn't stay in the woods. We stuck to the roadside, ready to dive into the trees at the first sign of danger. After what felt like hours, we heard a car approaching. We hid in the brush, praying it wasn't them. Thankfully, it was an older man in an old sedan. We waved him down, desperate for help. After briefly explaining the situation, he agreed to take us to the nearest sheriff's office. Exhausted but relieved, the man, Jeff, drove us to a small town called Ellington and dropped us off at the sheriff's office. We gave our statements about the three men and everything that happened. The sheriff, a grizzled veteran named Stewart, took us seriously. He sent out a patrol to search for my truck and promised they would catch those men. "You two are lucky to be alive," he said. Neil and I exchanged a look. We were alive, but it had been a close call. A few hours later, the deputies found my truck abandoned in the woods, but there was no sign of the men. We thanked the sheriff and got back on the road, still shaken. I never saw Neil again after that night, although we exchanged phone numbers and promised to stay in touch. I think about him every time I pass through southern Missouri. That experience changed me. It made me more cautious and aware of the dangers on the road. I still help people when I can, but I'm always on guard now, ready for anything. Every time I drive down a dark, lonely stretch of highway, I wonder if those men ever got caught or if they're still out there looking for their next target. But life goes on, and so do I. There's always another load to haul and another destination to reach. As long as I'm behind the wheel, I'll keep moving forward, no matter what the road throws my way. A truck driver is always on the move, always looking ahead to the next route. One night, I had a scary experience that I still remember clearly. Back then, I worked nights at an old ranch in Arizona that had been turned into a hotel. It was an easy job, but the hour-and-a-half drive home each night was tiring. At first, it took away my free time, but I got used to it over time. One night, I stopped at a taco truck about halfway home because I was starving and couldn't wait to eat. The truck was parked outside an RV park, and I had seen it a few times over the past 2 months, but had never stopped. This night, my stomach growled, so I pulled off the road and walked to the truck. To my surprise, the tacos were some of the best I'd ever had. I ordered them to go and ate in my car, feeling like I had found a hidden gem. The next night, I stopped there again, and it quickly became part of my routine. I enjoyed my tacos, tried the different salsas, and finished with a soda and a cigarette. The taco guy even had lemon-scented hand wipes, which he always gave me. I must have visited him 40 or 50 times, but I never learned his name. It felt awkward to ask after so long, and he never asked for mine. One night, I parked in my usual spot and walked to the taco truck, but something felt off. For the first time, the taco guy wasn't there, and there were no customers around. I thought maybe he was just out of sight, so I called out to him, but no one answered. The silence was eerie, and I started to smell something burning. I tried to look over the counter to see if something was cooking, but I couldn't see anything. I felt worried. If something was burning, it could cause a fire. I didn't want him to lose his truck or his livelihood, so I decided to step in and turn off the grill. I walked around to the side of the truck, climbed the stairs, and opened the door. Inside, I saw the cash register open with coins scattered everywhere. At first, I thought maybe he had been robbed, but there were no signs of a struggle. Then, I looked at the grill and my heart stopped. There, I saw a charred outline of a hand, completely burned. I stumbled back down the stairs but managed to stay on my feet. Trying to stay calm, I opened the compartment under the grill and shut off the gas. Without looking back, I closed the door and walked to my car to call the police. When I called 911, I struggled to explain the situation. I knew someone had been hurt, but I didn't even know the taco guy's name. The operator asked me questions, and I did my best to answer. They said officers would be on their way. I waited for about 30 or 40 minutes, but no one came. I sat there for nearly an hour, feeling numb and confused about what had happened. I couldn't understand why the police hadn't shown up right away. I regretted not learning the taco guy's name. If I had, maybe I could have helped track him down. In the days that followed, I searched online for news about a taco truck owner who had been burned in a robbery, but I found nothing. The taco truck never returned, and I never saw the taco guy again. To this day, I just hope he's okay. For years, my best friend Victoria and I had been planning this trip, and it was finally time. We were on our mid-semester break, and we really needed to get away from the stress of college, especially since we were in our senior year and the work had been tough lately. Like me, Victoria was an only child, which made us bond even more. We had been close friends for about 4 years, and I couldn't imagine my college experience without her. Outside our dorm, we said goodbye to everyone as we got ready to head home for the break. We had already told our parents we'd be spending this time together, and with our bags packed, it was finally time to get into the car and hit the road. I was driving because it was my car, my prized possession, which my parents gave me for my 20th birthday. Victoria entered the address into the GPS, and we were ready to go. The journey would take about 6 hours to reach the resort where we had booked our stay. The trip started off smoothly, with Victoria and me chatting about our classes and gossiping about classmates and professors. I really enjoyed being with Victoria, and I felt grateful for our friendship. However, about 3 hours into our drive, the gas light flickered on. I decided to stop at the nearest gas station, which was about 15 minutes away. When we arrived, I hurried to refuel because I didn't want to take too long. As I reached for the nozzle, I suddenly heard a scream behind me. I turned around and saw a man with a gun yelling at me to get on the ground. He had a scar on his face and tattoos all over, making him look really scary. Another man was standing by the entrance, and he also pulled out a gun. I looked at Victoria, who was frozen in fear. I glanced at the other cars at the pumps, hoping to find someone who could help us, but they were all empty. I couldn't believe it. This gas station seemed like a trap for unsuspecting travelers like us, far away from the city. The man yelled that if we didn't get on the ground, he would shoot us and do terrible things to us. His threats were terrifying, and I was scared. I dropped the nozzle and shouted at Victoria to comply, but she seemed to be in shock. I could see her breathing rapidly, her eyes wide with fear. I knew she often panicked in situations like this, and I became really worried about her. The leader grew impatient, demanding we get on the ground. I pleaded, "Please, let me get my friend out." Holding my breath, I hoped he would agree. He gestured for me to continue, so I quickly jumped into the car, shaking Victoria to get her attention. Finally, her eyes met mine, showing her sheer terror. I urged her to breathe and focus. Instead of pulling her out, I started the car and pressed the gas pedal, taking off from the gas station without thinking. I heard the man cursing behind us, and then I heard their car's engine start. I didn't know how I managed everything so quickly, but as I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw they were following us. They probably didn't expect me to take a chance and flee. Now we were being chased, and I prayed I hadn't made a terrible mistake. "It's going to be okay," I reassured Victoria, and she silently nodded. Just then, something metallic hit the car, and I lost control of the steering wheel for a moment. The car began swerving back and forth. I yelled at Victoria while trying to duck down, realizing they were shooting at us. The guy in the passenger seat leaned out of the car, aiming his weapon at us. I tried to stay calm, but inside, I was shaking with fear. We didn't want to die, especially not like this. We were too young for that, but it felt like a real possibility as their car got closer. I kept my head down and tried to speed up, but they were ramming into the back of our car, trying to force me off the road. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, feeling a mix of fear and anger. Victoria was crying and shaking beside me. Another bullet hit the side of the car, and I cursed the emptiness of the road since we hadn't seen another vehicle since we left. Suddenly, an idea popped into my head, and I hoped it would work. I waited for them to ram us again, watching their movements. When I saw their car speed up, I slammed on the brakes and swerved to the side. They sped past us, and as soon as they did, I hit the gas and sharply turned the car into their direction, sideswiping them. The impact caused their driver to lose control, and everything happened in a blur. Their car spun off the road and overturned, flipping and shattering as it crashed. I didn't care if they survived. I just wanted to escape. I pressed down on the gas and sped away, leaving them far behind. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel as I focused on calming down. I pulled over a bit later to check the car. They had fired several shots, but luckily only 2 had hit the car, and neither was serious. We were okay. After making sure everything was fine, I resumed driving. Thankfully, we made it to our destination, without needing to stop at another gas station. When we finally arrived at the resort, we were shaken, but ultimately safe. The whole incident had put a damper on our spirits, but we promised to try to enjoy the trip. This would be a road trip we would never forget. In 2016, my family and I decided to leave our old apartment in Mississippi. My parents often said life was easier there. They never really liked living in the city, and as they got older, they wanted the peace and quiet of country life. Airfare was high at that time, and we didn't have much extra money, so my parents chose to drive instead. It was a long journey, about 13 hours, but we had taken many road trips over the years, so we were ready for it. We packed our bags and hit the road. The trip was going fine until we were halfway there. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up to the car slowing down. I asked my dad why we stopped, and then I saw a person lying in the middle of the road. It looked like a woman, maybe in her 50s, with light brown hair and a sweater. My parents were anxious. My dad, being a former Marine, got out to help. Mom and I stayed in the car watching. But when my dad got closer, he quickly backed away and jumped back in the car. His face was full of shock. He sped away, and I caught a glimpse of what scared him. The woman's face looked unsettling. Her eyes were wide open, and her jaw was oddly positioned. There was some blood around her nose, and she had bruises. It was a shocking sight. Next to her, there was a blue star spray painted on the road, but we didn't know what it meant. My family wondered if it was a sign of some dangerous group or even a cult. It sounded far-fetched, but I understood why we thought that. After 4 more hours, we arrived in the next town. Thankfully, my dad was able to file a police report. We couldn't remember exactly where we saw the woman, just that it was on a lonely road. I hoped the police would look into it. 3 months later, while I was in Walmart, I found a magazine about disappearances. I loved mysteries, so I started flipping through it. As I looked at the photos, one caught my eye. It had the same blue star from that night. This time, it showed a body at the base of a tree with the blue star spray painted on the trunk. The title said something about finding the symbol while hiking. The comments were wild. Some people thought it was linked to a cult called the Smiley Face Killers, while others suspected it was a drug cartel fight. There were even theories about aliens, but the most serious suggestion was that a group of assassins called the Star Killers was behind it all. In the end, no one really knows who did it. All we have are these scary theories, and there still hasn't been an official report about those terrible crimes. A few years ago, I was driving home on a quiet road at night. I had just made a turn and was about 15 minutes away from home when my car started slowing down and making strange noises. I was confused because my car had always run well. Then I realized I had run out of gas. The warning light had come on earlier, but I forgot about it. My car came to a complete stop, and I felt really foolish for being so careless. I thought about calling a friend for help, but when I took out my phone, I saw I had no signal. I wasn't surprised, but I kept trying for about 20 minutes, and nothing worked. It was late, so even if my phone had worked, my friends were probably asleep. I knew there was a gas station about a mile away, and it would take me about 30 minutes to walk there. The weather was nice, so I decided to walk and get some gas. It wasn't a big deal. I got out of my car and found a small empty gas container in the back, which I usually kept for my mower. I took it and started walking along the roadside. It was really quiet, and I didn't see any cars pass by. There wasn't even a sidewalk, so I walked on the grass a few feet from the road. Dense forest lined both sides. As I walked, I noticed the headlights of a pickup truck slowing down as it approached my car. I thought they might be stopping to help, so I considered asking for a ride to the gas station. But then I saw 2 men get out, one from the passenger side and another from the driver's side. They pulled ski masks over their faces and walked toward my car. Fear gripped me, and I froze, hoping they wouldn't see me. I was pretty sure they thought I was still inside my car. I quickly backed into the woods to get a better look. I watched as they rummaged through my car, peering into the windows and using a phone as a flashlight. One of them knocked on the window, trying to see if anyone was inside, and they tried opening the doors, which I had locked. Then they started looking around, seemingly searching for me. When they glanced in my direction, I did my best to hide, but I think they noticed me anyway. One of the men walked toward the woods while the other went back to the truck. Seeing this, I turned around and tried to sneak deeper into the trees to keep moving toward the gas station. But then I heard footsteps running toward me. When I looked back, the first guy was sprinting to the truck. They climbed in and started driving toward my direction. I had no choice but to dive into the woods and run as fast as I could. I didn't know where I was going. I just ran, terrified of what they might do. The forest was full of trees and branches, and I kept tripping. I could hear the guy behind me getting closer, so I just kept going, even though I had no idea where the edge of the forest was. After what felt like several minutes, I finally broke free from the trees and spotted a house with a big yard. I ran toward it, hoping to call for help. I realized I didn't hear the guy behind me anymore, so I ran around the back of the house, held my breath, and thought about what to do next. I didn't want to knock on the front door and scare anyone unless I had to. I waited a few minutes, and seeing no sign of the men in the truck, I decided to go back to the road. It was a long trek, but eventually, I made it back to the road I had been on, staying alert for any sign of the truck. Thankfully, it was nowhere in sight. I continued walking to the gas station, staying close to the edge of the woods so I could hide quickly if I saw the truck coming. A little while later, I heard a car coming, so I jumped into the woods and hid, trying to blend in with the bushes. I couldn't tell if it was the truck, so I didn't want to take any chances. Finally, I made it to the gas station, filled my container as quickly as I could, and then walked back to my car. I filled my tank in record time and drove home at full speed, feeling a huge sense of relief when I parked in my garage. Looking back, I still don't know what those men wanted or who they were, but it didn't seem good. So always remember to keep your gas tank filled and carry an extra container in your car. It could save you from a scary situation on a dark road. I've spent a lot of my life driving long distances for work, covering nearly every major highway in the state. There's something calming about being on the road for hours, watching the scenery change and listening to the hum of the tires. But one night on Highway 22, something happened that still troubles me, and I have questions that no one can answer. It was late, around 11 p.m., and I was heading home from a job site in the next town over. Highway 22 goes through a pretty isolated area, with long stretches of road and not much around but fields and woods. There aren't many cars on that route after dark, and that night I hadn't seen another vehicle for over an hour. The only light came from my headlights cutting through the darkness. As I drove, I noticed a figure on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was an animal, but as I got closer, I realized it was a man standing at the edge of the highway with his thumb out, like he was trying to hitch a ride. I slowed down instinctively, but something about the way he stood made me hesitate. He was tall and skinny, wearing an old military jacket. His face was partly covered by a wide-brimmed hat, and he stood stiffly, almost unnaturally. What really unsettled me was that he wasn't looking at the road. He was facing the woods, his back turned to the highway. Despite my better judgment, I stopped my car a few feet ahead of him and rolled down the window slightly. "Hey, do you need a ride?" I called out. The man didn't respond or even turn around. The silence felt heavy and wrong. I was about to drive away when he slowly turned to face me. His movements were deliberate, like he was being pulled by invisible strings. When his face came into view, my stomach dropped. His eyes were wide and glassy, unfocused, like he didn't fully know where he was. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his lips were parted, but he didn't say anything. He just stared at me with his thumb still raised, not stepping toward the car. My hand hovered over the gear shift, ready to leave, but there was something in his expression that made me hesitate. It was like he was pleading with me without saying a word. Then, finally he spoke. "Don't go down that road," he said in a low, hoarse voice, like he hadn't spoken in days. "You won't come back." A chill ran through me. I glanced at the empty road ahead. It stretched out dark and still. Confused, I asked, "What are you talking about?" But he just kept staring, his thumb still out, as if he hadn't just spoken at all. I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I pulled away, my heart racing, leaving that strange man behind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong, but I just wanted to get home. A few miles down the highway, the road became even more isolated. The trees on both sides seemed to close in on me, their branches hanging low and casting long shadows across the asphalt. My headlights barely pierced the darkness, and the air felt heavy and cold. I'd driven this road dozens of times before, but that night it felt different, like I was somewhere else entirely. Suddenly, my car started to sputter. The engine whined and choked, and before I knew it, the car slowed to a crawl and finally stopped in the middle of the road. Stunned, I sat there with my heart pounding as the engine died completely. I tried to restart the car, but it wouldn't turn over. The dashboard lights flickered, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I was completely alone, stranded on an empty stretch of highway, with no cell service and no idea how far I was from the nearest town. I couldn't stop thinking about what the man had said. You won't come back. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just a coincidence. Cars break down, it happens. But the longer I sat there, the more I felt like I wasn't alone. Then I saw it in the rearview mirror. A figure stepped out of the woods. It was the same man, the hitchhiker, but something was different. His movements were slow, almost robotic as he walked toward my car. His head was tilted slightly and his arms hung limply at his sides. He didn't look like someone who needed help anymore. He looked like something that was following me. I didn't wait to see what he would do. I fumbled with my keys, trying the ignition again, and to my relief, the car sputtered to life. I floored the gas, speeding down the highway as fast as I could, not daring to look back. I don't know how long I drove after that. Time felt distorted, like I was stuck in a loop. The trees blurred together, the road seemed to stretch on forever, and every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see that man staring back at me. Eventually, I reached the outskirts of the next town, and the heaviness in the air seemed to lift. I pulled into a gas station and sat there for a long time, my hands shaking as I tried to make sense of what had happened. I told myself it was just exhaustion, that my mind had played tricks on me. But when I asked the locals about Highway 22, one older man at the gas station gave me a strange look. "You shouldn't be driving down that road at night," he said quietly. "Not after what happened to those people." "What people?" I asked, my throat dry. "A couple of years back, there was a wreck. A car went off the road into the woods. They never found the driver, just the passenger wandering around in the trees. He'd lost his mind, babbling about how the road doesn't let you leave. I didn't ask any more questions. I didn't want to know. To this day, I avoid Highway 22. I've told a few people about what happened, but no one believes me. They think I was just tired and imagined it all. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget the look on that man's face when he told me not to go down that road. I don't think I was supposed to come back. I've always loved riding my motorcycle. There's a freedom in being on two wheels that you just can't get in a car. The wind in my face and the open road in front of me is the best feeling. But now, every time I ride, especially at night, I can't shake the memory of what happened last summer. I was coming back from a weekend trip in the mountains, taking the long way home to enjoy the ride. It was late, around 1 a.m., when I hit a long stretch of highway through the desert. The road was empty, with only my bike's headlight and a few distant stars lighting the way. I didn't mind riding alone at night. I had done it many times before. About half an hour into the ride, I noticed something in my mirrors. At first, it was just a small speck of light far behind me. I thought it might be another bike or a car, nothing unusual. But as I kept going, I realized the light was getting closer, but not at a normal speed. It stayed back just far enough that I could see it in my mirrors, but I couldn't make out any details. I sped up, hoping to put some distance between us, but the light stayed with me, always maintaining the same distance. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe just a cautious rider keeping a safe distance. But the longer it went on, the more uneasy I felt. I slowed down, giving them a chance to pass, but they didn't. It felt like they were stalking me, watching my every move. I looked at my fuel gauge. I had half a tank left, enough to make it to the next town, but I still felt uneasy. I scanned the horizon for any signs of civilization, but all I saw was the endless desert. Then suddenly the light behind me disappeared. One second it was there, and the next it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting the rider to be beside me, but there was nothing, just empty highway behind me. I slowed down, confused. Had they turned off? There hadn't been any exits for miles. Maybe they had stopped or pulled off to the side, but there was no sign of them anywhere. I rode in silence for a few minutes, feeling the uneasiness fade. Maybe I had imagined it all, or they decided to turn around. I started to relax, letting the wind clear my head. That's when I heard it, the low rumble of an engine. At first it was so quiet I thought I was imagining it. But as I listened, it grew louder, like someone was creeping up behind me. I glanced in my mirrors again, and my heart skipped a beat. There was the light again, and this time it was much closer. I tightened my grip on the handlebars, my pulse quickening. Whoever was behind me wasn't playing around anymore. They were closing in fast. I sped up, hoping to shake them off, but their engine matched mine, the light growing brighter in my mirrors. They were right behind me now, so close I could almost feel the heat from their engine. I pushed my bike to its limit, but no matter how fast I went, they stayed right on my tail, their headlamp blinding me. I swerved into the left lane, hoping to get some distance, but they followed, moving in perfect sync with me. I thought about stopping or pulling over, but being alone on the side of the road with this person terrified me. Then, without warning, they swerved into the opposite lane and pulled up beside me. I glanced over, my heart racing. The rider was wearing a helmet with a dark visor, so I couldn't see their face. But there was something off about how they were sitting. Their posture was stiff, and their movements were jerky, like they weren't used to riding. They didn't look at me. They just kept their bike steady next to mine, matching my speed exactly. For a few terrifying seconds, we rode side by side, the rumble of our engines the only sound in the night. I felt adrenaline surge through me, telling me to get away. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they swerved back behind me and disappeared again. The road was empty, with no lights, no sound, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I didn't stop riding until I reached the next town. I pulled into a gas station and parked under the bright lights, my hands shaking and my heart still racing from the encounter. I waited there for a long time, half expecting the other rider to pull in behind me, but they never did. I've tried to rationalize what happened that night. Maybe it was just a reckless biker trying to scare me for fun, but something about the way they rode felt unnatural. Because of that, I don't ride at night anymore, especially not on empty highways. I've never really believed in supernatural stuff or wild conspiracy theories. But what happened to me last year on Route 67 still makes me question everything. Months have gone by, and I've thought about it over and over, but I can't figure out what happened that night. I was driving home from a work trip, and I was really tired. By the time I left my last meeting, it was past 10 p.m. I knew the drive would take a few hours, so I decided to take Route 67, a quieter back road that goes through some small towns and farmland. I had driven that way many times before, but always during the day. At night, it felt completely different, pitch black with only a few streetlights and the glow of farmhouses far away. To stay awake, I turned on the radio and flipped through the stations. Most of them were static since I was in the middle of nowhere. I could only find country music or old talk shows. After driving for about an hour, something strange happened. As I was scanning through stations, the static suddenly stopped. A man's voice came through loud and clear, but it wasn't music or a commercial. He was reading something that sounded odd. At 2:07 a.m., the car will break down. Do not get out. Do not respond. I froze, my hand still on the dial. The voice continued. You are being watched. Stay inside the vehicle. It was calm and steady, almost robotic. I glanced at the clock. It was just past midnight. I thought it was just a prank or a creepy radio show trying to scare late-night drivers. But the tone of the voice unsettled me. It felt too personal. Then the voice said something that chilled me. Route 67 is not safe. Do not stop. Do not turn back. My heart raced. I changed the station, hoping to hear something else, but all I got was static. I flipped back, and the man's voice was still there. At 2:07 a.m., do not open the door. My hands were sweating. I turned off the radio, hoping the silence would help. But the darkness outside felt heavy, and the road seemed endless. I tried to focus on driving, but something felt really wrong. For the next hour, I kept checking the clock. Why was that time so important? I told myself I was just overthinking it, but as 2 a.m. approached, the tension in my chest grew. Then, right at 2:07 a.m., my car sputtered, and the engine made a loud choking noise. My stomach dropped. I pressed the gas, but the car slowed down until it stopped in the middle of the highway. My heart pounded as I sat in stunned silence, staring at the dark road ahead. The words from the radio echoed in my mind. Do not get out. Do not respond. I tried restarting the car, but nothing happened. My headlights dimmed, leaving me in almost total darkness. I checked my phone, but I had no signal, and there were no other cars on the road. I wanted to check the engine, but those words kept playing in my head. I locked the doors and gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The highway was completely silent, except for the soft hum of the cooling engine. Then, in the distance, I saw headlights. At first, I felt relief. Maybe another car could help me. But as the car got closer, I noticed it was swerving slightly, like the driver wasn't in control. The vehicle slowed down and came to a stop about 50 feet away. I squinted through the darkness, but I couldn't see the driver. The windows were too dark. Suddenly, the radio turned back on by itself. The man's voice came through again. Do not get out of the car. I didn't move. I could feel my heart racing as I watched the car idling softly. I knew whoever was in that car wasn't there to help me. Then the other car's door opened. A figure stepped out, tall and slim, dressed in dark clothing. I couldn't see their face, but the way they moved slowly sent a chill down my spine. They stood there for a moment, staring at my car, then took a step toward me. I locked the doors, my heart racing as the man's words blared in my mind. Do not open the door. The figure took another step, moving slowly toward me. I fumbled with my phone, desperately trying to get a signal, but there was nothing. I felt trapped on this dark stretch of highway. Just as the figure reached the edge of my headlights, they stopped and stared at me through the windshield. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their eyes watching me. Then, without warning, they turned and walked back to their car. The door slammed shut and the engine roared to life. The car sped off into the night, disappearing down the highway as quickly as it had come. I sat there shaking, trying to make sense of what just happened. My car was still dead, and the highway was dark and empty again. Then, without me touching it, the radio crackled back to life one last time. Stay on Route 67. Do not turn back. I didn't sleep that night. Eventually, another driver passed by, and I was able to get a tow back to the nearest town. I told the mechanic what happened, but he just shrugged and said it was probably a random engine failure. But I knew it wasn't just that. Now I don't drive on Route 67 anymore. I take the long way around, even if it adds hours to my trip. I've never told anyone what happened that night. Not really, because I know they wouldn't believe me. But I can't stop wondering who that voice on the radio was and why it knew what would happen to me. This happened to me a few years ago, and I still think about it every time I drive alone at night. I used to love long drives. There's something calming about being on the open road, especially late at night when there's hardly any traffic. But now, I can't drive more than an hour on a highway without feeling that same creeping dread I felt that night. It was around 1 a.m., and I was heading home from a friend's place about 3 hours away. I didn't want to stay the night, so I decided to drive back even though it was late. The highway I took was mostly empty, a 2-lane road through miles of farmland and woods. The occasional car passing by was the only sign of life. About an hour into the drive, I noticed a car behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. People drive late all the time. But after a few minutes, I realized the car wasn't passing me. It was just sitting there, matching my speed and staying right behind me no matter how much I sped up or slowed down. I glanced at the rearview mirror to get a better look. It was an older sedan, and its headlights were bright and blinding. I couldn't see the driver's face, just the outline of a figure behind the wheel. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe they were tired, or distracted. But when I sped up a little more, hoping they would pass me or drop back, they didn't. They stayed right on my tail, almost like they were playing a game with me. The weird thing was, there was plenty of room to pass. The highway was wide open with no other cars in sight, yet this person refused to move. I started feeling uneasy. My heart raced as I realized they were intentionally staying behind me. I had heard stories about road rage or people messing with drivers late at night, but I never thought I would be one of those drivers. Finally, I decided to switch lanes and slow down, giving them every chance to pass me. I signaled, changed lanes, and dropped my speed, thinking that would finally make them go around. But they slowed down too, staying directly behind me and matching my every move. At this point, my unease turned into outright fear. I had no idea what this person wanted or why they were following me, but I knew I needed to get away from them. I sped up again, pushing my car well over the speed limit. The highway stretched out ahead of me, long and empty, but the car behind me kept up with every turn and acceleration. My fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I felt trapped. I couldn't pull over. Stopping on a desolate highway in the middle of the night with someone like this behind me felt like asking for trouble. I couldn't outrun them either. They weren't going anywhere. Then I saw a sign for a rest stop ahead. It wasn't much, just one of those tiny, unlit stops with a single bathroom and a vending machine. But it was something. Maybe if I pulled in, they would just drive past and leave me alone. As I approached the exit, I flicked on my turn signal, hoping the car would continue on the highway. But they didn't. They followed me into the rest stop. My hands were shaking, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The rest stop was completely empty. No other cars, no lights, just the faint glow from a flickering vending machine. I pulled into a parking spot, my mind racing. I didn't want to get out of the car. I couldn't trust whoever was behind me, but staying here with them felt even worse. As soon as I parked, the car behind me pulled in and stopped a few spaces away. Their headlights were still blinding, and they just sat there, engine idling. I watched them through my rearview mirror, waiting for something to happen. After a few tense moments, the driver's door opened. A tall man stepped out, wearing a dark hoodie with his hands shoved into his pockets. He didn't look at my car. Instead, he walked slowly toward the restroom building, his head down like he was just another traveler stopping for a break. But something about the way he moved, so deliberately and never glancing my way, set off alarm bells in my head. He wasn't acting like someone who needed to use the restroom. He was too calm, too intentional. I couldn't stay there. I didn't care what he was planning. I wasn't going to stick around to find out. The moment he disappeared behind the restroom building, I slammed my car into reverse, backing out of the parking spot as fast as I could. My tires screeched as I turned back onto the highway, my heart racing as I floored the gas. In my rearview mirror, I saw the man come back out from behind the building, his head snapping toward my car as I sped away. But I didn't look back. I didn't slow down. I drove for miles, glancing in my mirrors every few minutes, half expecting to see that car's headlights behind me again. But they never appeared. When I finally reached the next town, I pulled into a well-lit gas station and parked, my hands still shaking. I stayed in the car for a long time, just trying to calm down and convince myself that I was safe now. I never found out who that man was or why he had followed me for so long. Maybe it was just some guy trying to scare me for a laugh, or maybe it was something worse. I'll never know, but I do know this. I don't drive alone at night anymore. I had been driving for hours down a rural highway when my car suddenly broke down just before sunset. I had no signal on my phone, and I was far from any town. My car started sputtering and then just died on me. Now I was stuck on the side of the road, completely alone. I tried restarting the engine a few times, but nothing happened. At this point, I felt tired and frustrated. I got out and popped the hood, but I wasn't much of a mechanic, so I had no idea what to look for. I noticed some smoke rising from the engine, but that was all. I thought about walking to the nearest town, but I had no clue how far it was. Then I remembered passing a small road a few miles back that led to a driveway. I hoped there might be a house or someone who could help me down that road. I grabbed a flashlight from the trunk and started walking. As the sun set, it got dark quickly. When I reached the small driveway, I saw an old house hidden behind some trees. It looked abandoned, peeling paint, broken windows, and an overgrown yard. I wasn't sure if anyone lived there, but I decided to check anyway. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. The door was slightly open, so I knocked again and waited. Still nothing. Feeling desperate, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. It was dark and musty, and the only light came from a flickering lamp on a table. It felt strange, but I just wanted help with my car. While I was standing there, I heard footsteps coming from the back of the house. I felt nervous, but I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there? My car broke down, and I need help." No one responded, and the footsteps stopped. I decided to leave. Things were getting too weird, and I felt like I was intruding. But when I turned to leave, I found the door had shut behind me. I hadn't heard it close, and when I tried to open it, it was locked. That's when I started to panic. I looked around for a way out, but the only window was too high to reach. I frantically tried to unlock the door when I heard a low, raspy whisper behind me. "What are you doing here?" I spun around, but no one was there. My heart raced, and I felt like I might faint. I kept trying the door, but it wouldn't budge. Then I heard the footsteps again, much closer this time. I turned slowly and saw a figure standing in the shadows. It was hard to make out any details, but it looked like a man. He moved closer, and I could see he was wearing a hood. I backed away trying to stay calm and said, "I'm sorry, I just needed help with my car." The man didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me. My fear grew by the second, and I knew I had to do something before he got any closer. In a burst of desperation, I grabbed a heavy vase from the table and threw it at him. It shattered, and the man hesitated for a moment. That was my chance. Somehow, I managed to force the door open and bolted outside. I didn't stop running until I reached the road. My car was still there, but it was getting darker, and I felt completely alone. I sat in my car, locked the doors, and waited for 3 long hours, hoping a car would pass by. Finally, I saw headlights approaching. I got out, waved my flashlight, and flagged the driver down. He was a kind man and offered to drive me to the next town. He dropped me off safely, and I finally had enough phone signal to call a tow truck. Looking back, I realized going into that house was a bad idea, especially since I was uninvited. But I was panicking, and my broken down car left me desperate for help. I hope I never have to go through something like that again. I was driving home late one night, taking the back roads to avoid traffic on the interstate. The night was quiet, and the road was narrow, with thick woods on both sides. It always felt a bit eerie when I was the only one driving on it. Around midnight, I suddenly felt a jolt. My truck swerved a little, but I quickly got it back under control and pulled over to the side of the road. I got out, leaving the engine running to keep the headlights on, and walked to the back. Sure enough, one of the rear tires was completely flat. "Great," I muttered, shaking my head. Luckily, I always kept a spare tire and a jack, so I figured I could change the tire and be on my way quickly. I grabbed the tools and the spare tire and started working. The night was still, almost too still. It was one of those nights where everything felt extra quiet, like the whole world was asleep. The only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional chirp of crickets. I told myself I'd be back on the road soon, and there was nothing to worry about. But then I started to hear something strange. At first, I thought I was imagining it, a steady, rhythmic thumping noise, like someone tapping a drum in the distance. I stopped what I was doing and listened, but it stopped as soon as I paid attention. I figured it was just the woods making weird sounds and went back to changing the tire. A minute later, the thumping started again, louder this time. It made me uneasy, but I tried to ignore it and focused on my work. Then I heard something even weirder, whispers. Faint, almost inaudible whispers coming from the trees. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but just hearing them sent a chill down my spine. I stood up, wiped my hands on my pants, and grabbed my flashlight from the truck. I shined it toward the woods and scanned the trees, but all I could see was darkness. The trees stood tall and still, like silent guards. The whispers continued, just loud enough for me to hear, but too quiet to understand. The thumping grew louder, and my heart began to race. I hurried to finish changing the tire, not wanting to stay out there longer. As I worked, the whispers and thumping seemed to get closer, but I kept telling myself it was just my imagination. Then I heard it, a low, deep growl from the woods. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard before. My hands started to shake as I tightened the lug nuts, trying to work faster. I stood up and scanned the woods again with my flashlight, but there was nothing, just more trees and shadows. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of twigs snapping, like something was moving through the trees. I could feel the hair on my neck standing up. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be lurking in the darkness, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. With my hands trembling, I quickly packed up my tools and threw them in the back of the truck. I wanted to get out of there fast. I was almost done when everything suddenly went silent. The growling, the whispers, the thumping, it all stopped just like that. I paused, listening for any sound, but there was nothing. The silence was so intense it felt like the whole world had stopped. I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't know whether to be relieved or more scared. I took one last glance at the woods, ready to jump into the truck and drive away. That's when I saw it, something moving between the trees. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a shadow darting from one tree to another. It was fast, too fast to see clearly, but I knew it was there. My heart pounded as I tried to figure out what it was. It was too dark to see, but whatever it was big. I didn't wait around to find out. I jumped into the truck, slammed the door shut, and turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I threw the truck into gear, my hands still shaking. As I pulled back onto the road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing me. I sped down the road, trying to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever was back there. My heart raced the whole drive home, and I couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. The whispers, the growls, the shadow. It was like something out of a nightmare. I didn't stop until I was safely back in my driveway, and even then, I sat in the truck for a minute, trying to calm down. It's been years since that night, but I still think about it sometimes. I've driven those back roads since, but nothing like that ever happened again. I don't know what was out there in the woods that night, but whatever it was real. I'll never forget the sound of those whispers, or the sight of that shadow darting between the trees. Sometimes, late at night when I'm driving alone, I still feel like something is watching me from the woods, just waiting to make its move. When I was 13, something happened that still makes me feel uneasy when I think about it. It was Halloween night in 2012, and my friends, Max, Theo, Lou, and I had planned a regular night of trick-or-treating. We met at my house since it was close to the nicer neighborhood where the big houses always gave out the best candy. Our plan was simple: start on my street, hit the good spots, and then loop around the quieter part of town. Before we left, Lou mentioned he had something from his cousin, and like the goofy kids we were, we tried it out behind my house before heading off. At first, everything went great. We filled our bags with candy and crossed into the fancy neighborhood. By the time we were heading back, most houses had their lights off. Just when we were ready to call it a night, we saw one last house with its lights still on. It was part of a row of identical townhouses, and something about it felt strange, but we were still excited to get more candy. We went up the steps and rang the doorbell. After a minute, we heard heavy footsteps, and a man answered. He looked like he was in his mid-40s, wearing an old t-shirt and boxers. He seemed tired, but he smiled and made a joke about how we must be the last trick-or-treaters. He said we deserved a special treat and told us to wait while he went to get it. We stood there, thinking nothing of it. But when he came back, instead of candy, he was holding a bunch of black DVD cases. He grinned, showing us the cases and telling us to take whichever we wanted. His smile was strange and his teeth looked really bad, almost orange. We glanced at the covers and realized they were not regular movies. Max quickly said we just wanted candy, but the guy's grin got wider. He kept talking, trying to convince us to take them, but something felt really wrong. We started to back away, trying to stay calm. As we were about to leave, the man did something that made us all freeze for a moment. He continued talking, saying we could come inside and have more treats, but we knew it was time to go. Without another word, we ran off his porch and didn't stop until we were halfway down the street. When I looked back, he was standing at the end of his driveway, just watching us. We ran all the way back to my house, breathless and nervous. Nobody said anything at first. We just sat there, trying to figure out what had happened. Eventually, Theo joked that maybe we'd overreacted, but deep down, we all knew that man was off. The next day, feeling braver in the daylight, we grabbed some eggs from my fridge and went back to his house. We threw them at his porch and windows, laughing as we ran off. After that, we never went back to that block for Halloween. And even now, when I think about trick-or-treating, I remember how a fun night with my friends took a creepy turn that still makes me shiver. A few years ago, something strange happened on Halloween. Where I come from, people believe that during this time, spirits come back to visit their loved ones. Some say they show up as odd insects, like big moths, hanging around houses or lights. To honor them, families set out food, light candles, and say prayers, especially those who stay inside on Halloween night. The air always feels different around this time, like there's more energy, as if we're all waiting for the spirits to arrive. That Halloween night, I decided to join the tradition. While everyone else stayed inside, I sat by the front door with 5 candles, lighting a path for any spirits that might visit. The air was thick and still, no wind, just the kind of quiet that comes after a storm. Everything felt calm, too calm, and the darkness around seemed endless. The candles were the only light, their flames steady in the cool night. At first, I wasn't expecting anything weird to happen. I watched the flames, kind of lost in thought. But after a while, something strange happened. The flames, all 5 of them, started to bend, not like a small flicker from a breeze, but sharply, as if someone was blowing on them. But there was no wind. The air was completely still. I stared, confused and a bit nervous. The trees didn't move. There were no sounds, nothing that explained what was happening. The candles kept bending, all in the same direction, like an invisible hand was pushing them. A cold feeling crept over me. My mind tried to explain it. Maybe it was a trick of the light or the way I'd set the candles. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The air was too thick and still for it to be the wind. Suddenly, I couldn't sit still anymore. I jumped up and ran down the street, heart racing. I didn't stop until I reached a streetlight far from the house. I looked back, half expecting to see something following me. But all I saw was the faint glow of the candles and the light from inside the house. A few minutes later, my dad called me back in for dinner. Still shaken, I walked slowly back to the house, staring at the candles. When I got closer, they looked completely normal, half melted and gently flickering, like nothing had happened. When I told my family what I saw, they just laughed and said it was my imagination. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, something I couldn't explain. Years later, after I was married with kids, it happened again. It was Halloween and we had just finished dinner. I went outside to light candles on the porch, holding my youngest son in my arms. It was a cool, clear night with stars twinkling overhead. From where I stood, I could see into the house. My wife was upstairs, putting our older son to bed, and our helper, Gina, was in the kitchen cleaning up. As I stood there, something caught my eye. Out of the corner of my vision, I saw a woman walking inside the house from the bathroom toward the kitchen. I thought it was Gina, so I called out, "Gina, don't forget to turn off the kitchen lights." But instead of hearing her reply from the kitchen, her voice came from upstairs, where she was talking to my wife. "I'm not done yet," she called down. Her words hit me, and my stomach dropped. If Gina was upstairs, who did I just see walking into the kitchen? I asked my dad, who was watching TV in the living room, if anyone was in the kitchen. He didn't even look away from the screen and said, "Nope, no one's in there." Feeling a chill run down my spine, I rushed inside and told my wife what happened. She listened and told me to calm down. But later that night, after the kids were asleep, she admitted that she had seen the same thing, a woman, but outside by the fence. She said the woman hadn't walked through any doors. She had just appeared, moving silently. I don't know who or what we saw, but every Halloween, When I light candles outside, I can't help but feel like something is watching, waiting for its chance to visit again. I was 19, working at this sketchy motel that seemed to attract nothing but trouble. The place was run down, and most of the guests were locals, usually up to no good. The cops were regulars, showing up sometimes more than once a week. I worked both at the front desk, checking in all kinds of shady people at all hours, and in housekeeping, cleaning up after them. It wasn't a great job, but it paid the bills. One afternoon, I was assigned to clean rooms in the second building, the one furthest from the office. I always hated it over there. The rooms were in bad shape, and it was always too quiet. I was cleaning one of the last rooms when I saw something in the mirror. A man in his 50s, with greasy hair, just staring at me. I screamed, completely freaked out. The room was supposed to be empty, so he had no reason to be there. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there with a crooked grin on his face, holding out $100 bill. Right away, I knew something was wrong. Who tips $100 for a $40 room? He introduced himself as Terry, said he was staying in the room next door with his wife, Cherie. He smelled like car oil and alcohol, and it made me feel sick. Then he said, "We've been watching you. We want to have some fun." My heart dropped. I tried to brush him off politely, but he kept insisting, telling me to meet his wife. I knew there was no wife. It was just him, and he was seriously creeping me out. I finally got him to leave, but I was shaking. I tried calling my manager, but the phone wasn't working. That's when I started to panic. Was he coming back? Did he mess with the phone line? My cell phone was outside on my housekeeping cart, but the door was locked, and I was too scared to go get it. Eventually, I worked up the nerve to grab my key card and run for it. As soon as I stepped outside, I heard him shouting behind me, and I knew he was chasing me. I ran to a stockroom, locked the door, and hid until I couldn't hear him anymore. When I finally made it to the front desk, I collapsed into my boss's arms, and he called the police. By the time the cops arrived, the guy and whoever else was with him were gone. It turned out he had a criminal record: sexual assault, gross sexual imposition, even rape. I quit shortly after that. The whole thing terrified me, and I promised myself I'd never work at another motel again. This happened to me last year while I was on a business trip. I arrived at the hotel and picked up the room key that my company had paid for. The hotel looked nice enough, though it was smaller than most. There were about 30 or 40 rooms spread over 3 stories. My room was on the top floor, so I took the elevator up and made my way down the hallway. When I got to my room, I put my bags down and reached into my pocket for the key. Just then, the door to the room next to mine opened, and a man stepped out into the hallway. He smiled and greeted me, saying he was my neighbor, then offered his hand for a handshake. I was a little confused, but shook his hand and told him my name. After that, I went into my room, and I noticed he went right back into his room and closed the door. It felt a little weird that someone would come out of their hotel room just to say hi, but I shrugged it off. Some people are just like that, I guess. I unpacked my small suitcase and duffel bag, then laid on the bed and turned on the TV. It was late, and I was tired from the flight, so I planned to get to bed early. After a quick shower, I turned off the lights and tried to fall asleep. About 20 minutes later, I heard the neighbor's door creak open, followed by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I could see the shadow of someone walking by my door, but they stopped right outside my room. Through the small strip of light under the door, I saw their shadow move closer, almost like they were peeking in. After a second, the shadow backed away and continued down the hall. That freaked me out. I got up, double-checked the locks on the door, and then went back to bed, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The next day, I went to meet my coworkers at a company office for a presentation and dinner. I didn't get back to the hotel until around 10 p.m., exhausted. I tossed my work bag on the bed and jumped in the shower. I was in there for about 10 minutes when, through the sound of the water, I heard the unmistakable beep of the electronic door lock unlocking. It was way too late for housekeeping, and the first thing that popped into my head was that creepy guy from next door. But I had no idea how he could have a key to my room. I stood frozen in the shower, listening as the door slowly opened and then shut. I could hear footsteps walking past the bathroom. My heart was pounding because whoever it was had to know I was in the shower. Terrified, I stepped out as quietly as I could and quickly threw on a pair of pants. I pressed my ear against the bathroom door and listened. I heard faint noises like someone rummaging through my bags. I was too scared to confront them. I didn't know if they had a weapon or what their intentions were. I felt completely helpless, paralyzed with fear. Then the room went silent. My phone was on the nightstand, out of reach, but I knew I had to do something. I decided that making noise might scare them off. Taking a deep breath, I banged on the bathroom door and yelled for help as loud as I could. I heard the footsteps run back toward the door and out into the hallway. I rushed out, locked the door, and grabbed my phone with shaky hands. I called 911 and then the front desk to report what happened. By the time the police arrived, the guy was long gone. Luckily, they found him in his car a few hours later. I don't know if he ever faced jail time, though, because they couldn't prove what his intentions were. But honestly, I'm convinced he was trying to kidnap me. There's no other reason I can think of for why he'd break into my room when he knew I was in there. It still creeps me out to think about what might have happened if I hadn't scared him off. On a solo road trip, I decided to spend the night at a small hotel in a quiet town. The place was charming but a bit worn down. The receptionist handed me an old-fashioned key and a note that said, "Room 307, beware the clock." My curiosity was piqued, so I headed to my room. Once inside, I noticed an antique clock on the wall, but its hands were frozen at midnight. I tried to wind it, but it wouldn't budge. That night, as I fell asleep, I heard distant thunder, and the storm outside grew stronger. At midnight, I was jolted awake by the sound of the clock chiming, even though it hadn't moved. Confused, I sat up, and the air felt heavy. The room seemed alive, pulsing with energy, and shadows danced along the walls like flickering candlelight. Suddenly, I spotted a figure standing by the window, silhouetted against the lightning. My heart raced as I moved closer, but the figure turned and melted into the shadows. "Help me," a voice whispered, echoing in the stillness. "Who are you?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. The voice grew clearer. "I was trapped here, lost in time. Please help me escape." Compassion washed over me as I realized the spirit was connected to the clock. "Tell me how," I urged, desperate to help. "You must set the clock right," the voice replied. "Only then will I be free." I looked at the clock, feeling the weight of its history pressing down on me. I focused on the hands, willing them to move. With a surge of energy, the clock finally clicked, and the hands began to spin until they struck one. A wave of light filled the room, and the figure reappeared, this time clearer and brighter. "Thank you," she said, her face full of gratitude. "You freed me." As the light faded, a warm feeling filled the room. The clock chimed again, but this time it sounded comforting. The next morning, I checked out, knowing I had experienced something truly special. The clock had resumed its duty as a keeper of time, and I promised to share her story with the world. Last year, I was on a road trip and planned to be gone for a few days. On the second night, I ended up in the middle of nowhere, with no clue where I was going to sleep. I wanted to find a hotel, but as I kept driving, it felt like I was getting farther from any town. My phone signal kept dropping, which made it hard to check for places to stay. By around 11 p.m., I pulled into a rest area and searched for nearby hotels. The closest option was a motel about 12 miles away, and even though I was exhausted, I decided to go for it. The motel was small and old, and the town it was in looked like it hadn't seen much action in years. The place gave me an eerie feeling. It had about 10 or 12 rooms, all on one level, with a small office attached to the side. When I arrived, the parking lot was almost empty, and the whole place reminded me of a scene from a horror movie. But it was cheap, just $29 for the night, so I figured it would be fine since I planned to leave early in the morning. I went to the office, where a man with a long beard sat behind the counter. He barely glanced at me when I asked for a room. I handed over the $29, got the key, and headed to my room. The room was exactly what I expected, outdated and not very clean. The furniture looked old, and the TV was one of those big boxy ones from forever ago. I wasn't going to complain though. I just wanted to sleep. So I got ready for bed and lay down. After only a few minutes of lying there, I started to drift off. But then I felt this weird sensation, like something wasn't right. I opened my eyes and turned toward the window. That's when I saw someone moving away from it. It didn't seem like they were just passing by. It looked like they had been watching me. I couldn't tell who it was, but it made my skin crawl. I got up and closed the curtains, though they were so cheap they didn't fully cover the window. They were thin enough that you could almost see through them. But it was better than nothing. I peeked outside, but whoever had been there was gone. Trying to shake it off, I went back to bed, though I wasn't as relaxed anymore. I was still tired enough to eventually drift off again, but then that uneasy feeling hit me again. This time, I was already facing the window, so I opened my eyes, and sure enough, there was someone standing there again. At first, it was hard to see because of the flimsy curtains, but I caught a glimpse of a man's head before he moved away. I couldn't make out any details, but it was definitely someone. Now I was really spooked. I got up, looked out the window again, but the person had disappeared. The door was locked, and I tried to cover the window as best as I could, but I still didn't feel safe. I wanted to go back to sleep, but it took me a long time to relax. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when I woke up to the sound of my door squeaking open. It was an old, creaky door, so it made a lot of noise. I snapped awake and sat up. There was a man coming into my room. At first, I didn't know who he was, but as soon as he saw me awake, he bolted out the door. That's when I realized it was the guy from the front desk. I jumped out of bed, threw my stuff together as fast as I could, and got out of there. I drove back to the highway and ended up sleeping in my car at a rest stop for the rest of the night. As crazy as it sounds, I felt way safer in my car than I had at that motel. The next morning, I tried to call the motel to report what happened, but they hung up on me the moment I started explaining. So, I called the police and told them everything. I don't know what they did about it, but that guy was definitely a creep. I'm just glad I woke up when I did, because I don't even want to think about what could have happened if I hadn't. I really hope he doesn't do that to anyone else. My trip through the Scottish Highlands started off exciting. It was always a dream of mine to explore this beautiful place on my own, without the schedules and plans of family vacations. I never expected it to turn into a nightmare that would leave me scared and shaken. I rented a car in London and headed north, planning to visit the town of Malag. This was the beginning of a backpacking trip across Europe, or so I thought. As I drove through the highlands, amazed by the scenery, I spotted a small inn by the side of the road. It looked cozy and welcoming, so I decided to stop for the night. The innkeeper greeted me warmly, showing me to my room and chatting about local sights. I was thankful for her kindness and looked forward to a good night's rest before continuing my trip. But what seemed like a peaceful stay quickly took a dark turn. As night fell and the other guests went to their rooms, it was just me, the innkeeper, and the cook, who had been busy in the kitchen. I couldn't sleep, so I talked with the innkeeper, and she offered me a few drinks to help me relax. I'm not much of a drinker, but I didn't want to be rude, so I agreed. What started as a small drink turned into shot after shot, with the innkeeper filling my glass faster than I could finish. I had a bad feeling, but I ignored it. Soon, I was stumbling, unable to talk clearly. That's when I realized something was very wrong. I tried to leave, but the cook blocked me, pushing me toward the stairs leading to the cellar. With a hard hit to my back, I fell down the stairs, everything spinning before I passed out. When I woke up, I was alone. My head hurt and my side throbbed with pain. It didn't take long for me to realize what had happened. They drugged me and stole one of my kidneys. Terrified, I managed to get to my car. With no phone or wallet, I had to flag down a stranger for help. The police were called, but by the time they arrived, the innkeeper and cook were long gone, along with any trace of the inn. I went home, feeling violated and betrayed. What was supposed to be a trip of a lifetime turned into a nightmare that I'll never forget. The people who did this are still out there, hidden somewhere in the highlands, a reminder that even the most beautiful places can hide real danger. A strange night at the hotel. I was in my late 20s, working as a security guard at a large hotel in Las Vegas. It wasn't the job of my dreams, but it paid better than most jobs I was qualified for. The only real downside was the schedule. The hotel was short-staffed, so my shifts were all over the place. Sometimes I'd work mornings, other days it would be late at night, or even overnight. It was exhausting, and my sleep schedule was a mess. Still, I couldn't complain too much. The money made it worth it. One night, I was working the evening shift, which was pretty common. It was around 11 p.m., and my shift ended at midnight. I was hanging out at the front desk, talking to two of my coworkers, just killing time until we could clock out. We were in the middle of a conversation when the phone on the desk rang. I glanced at the number. It was from one of the hotel rooms. Nothing unusual, so I picked up. "Front desk, how can I help you?" I asked. On the other end, a man's voice answered, but he sounded frantic. "There's something strange going on in one of the rooms down the hall," he said. "I'm really worried about it." I paused for a second, confused. "What do you mean?" I asked. His voice got even more nervous. "You need to come up here." "I'm getting really scared," he said, almost panicking now. I told him I'd send security up right away, which of course meant I'd be going up myself. After I hung up, I quickly explained the situation to my coworkers. They looked just as puzzled as I felt. It wasn't every day that we got calls like this. I headed to the elevators, feeling a bit uneasy but trying not to show it. I went to the floor where the call came from and stepped out into the hallway. It was quiet, too quiet actually. The silence felt heavy, like something was off. I expected to hear whatever had freaked the guy out, but there was nothing. No noise, no sign of anything unusual. I walked down the hall toward the room. I thought the caller might be standing by the door, waiting for me, but when I got there, the door was closed and there was no one around. I knocked loudly, announcing myself as hotel security. Nothing. No sound, no movement from inside the room. I knocked again, waiting a little longer this time. Still nothing. After a minute or two, I started feeling nervous. This whole situation was weird. I walked to the end of the hallway, listening closely for anything strange. But everything was quiet, so I went back and knocked on the door again. Just then, the door behind me creaked open. I turned around to see an older woman peeking out. She looked scared. "Are you with security?" she asked quietly. "Yeah, I am," I said. "Did you hear anything strange coming from this room?" I pointed to the door where the call had come from. The woman nodded. "A few minutes ago, I heard loud noises, like something was banging around. It sounded like it was coming through the hallway, but I didn't know what it was," she said, her voice shaky. She seemed genuinely frightened. I thanked her and told her to stay in her room while I figured out what was going on. As she closed her door, I grabbed my walkie-talkie and called down to the front desk. "Hey, can you try calling that room again and let me know if they answer?" I asked. A few moments later, the front desk responded. "No answer," they said. Now I was starting to feel really uneasy. The caller had sounded so freaked out, and now there was no answer. I radioed back to the desk and asked them to check who was supposed to be staying in the room. There was a long pause on the other end, and I felt my pulse quicken as I waited for a response. Finally, they got back to me. No one's booked in that room tonight," they said. I blinked, feeling a cold chill run down my spine. "Nobody?" I repeated. "Yeah, it's supposed to be empty," the front desk confirmed. At that point, I didn't know what to think. I pulled out my security key card and swiped it to open the door. Since the room was supposed to be empty, I figured I'd better check it out myself. I stepped inside, and the room looked completely normal. It was clean, the bed was made, and everything seemed unused. There were no signs that anyone had been in there. I searched the entire room, closets, bathroom, under the bed, but found nothing. It was like nobody had ever been there. But then I noticed the phone. It was sitting on the nightstand, the same phone that had called the front desk just 15 minutes earlier. I turned it over and wrote down the serial number. I wanted to make sure that the call had actually come from this room. After leaving the room, I went back down to the lobby and checked the call logs. Sure enough, there was a record of a call being made from that room at the exact time I had answered it. Someone had definitely used that phone. I sat at my desk, feeling uneasy. How could a call have come from an empty room? And why had the man sounded so scared? I had no answers, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. The next morning, things got even stranger. One of the guests on that same floor was reported missing by a family member who was staying in another room. They hadn't seen him since the previous night. Security footage showed the guest leaving the hotel alone a few hours before I got that call. He hadn't returned, and no one had heard from him since. We reviewed all the footage from the hotel's entrances and exits, but there was no sign of him coming back. It was like he had vanished. I couldn't help but wonder if the call I received was somehow connected to the missing guest. The timing was too close to be a coincidence, but the person who made that call, whoever they were, was never identified, and the mystery of what happened in that room remains unsolved. As of today, the missing person still hasn't been found. I don't know who called me that night or what they were trying to tell me, but it's something I've never been able to forget. It still haunts me, even all these years later.